Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Devil's Den area of Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri, during what was supposed to be a simple team-building camping trip with my coworkers from Midwest Financial Solutions. I should have known something was wrong when Sarah Rodriguez first suggested the location. Sarah was our marketing director, the kind of woman who could sell ice to an Eskimo and had been pushing for months to get our department out of the office for some authentic wilderness bonding. She'd grown up in southern Missouri and claimed to know the area like the back of her hand, but there was something in her eyes when she mentioned Devil's Den, a flicker of something that made my stomach twist. "It's perfect," she'd insisted during our planning meeting, spreading topographical maps across the conference table. "Remote enough that we won't be disturbed by other campers, but not so isolated that we'll be completely cut off from civilization." Her finger traced a winding trail that led deep into the forest, ending at a small clearing marked with her red pen. "My grandfather used to hunt these woods. There are stories about the place, old Native American legends, but that just adds to the atmosphere, right?" Kevin King, our IT specialist, had pushed his thick-rimmed glasses up his nose and frowned at the maps. "Stories? What kind of stories?" Kevin was the type who needed facts, data, logical explanations for everything. At 35, he'd never been camping in his life and was already nervous about sleeping outdoors. Sarah's smile had faltered for just a moment. "Oh, you know how it is with rural areas. Locals love their ghost stories and folklore. Nothing to worry about." But she'd folded the maps quickly after that, as if she didn't want us looking too closely at the details. The other two members of our group seemed unconcerned. Jennifer Williams, no relation to me despite sharing a last name, was excited about finally getting to use the expensive camping gear she'd been buying online. At 28, she was the newest member of our HR department and eager to fit in with the team. Mark Clark, our sales representative, just wanted an excuse to drink beer around a campfire and tell inappropriate stories away from the office. At 31, Mark thought he was God's gift to women and outdoor adventure, though his idea of roughing it usually involved a hotel with fewer than 4 stars. We'd left Springfield on a Friday afternoon in October when the Missouri hills were painted in brilliant reds and golds. The drive to the trailhead took us deeper and deeper into the Ozarks, past small towns with names like Eminence and Winona, until we were winding along narrow gravel roads that seemed to lead nowhere. The trees grew denser, older, their gnarled branches creating a canopy so thick that even in broad daylight, the forest floor was shrouded in perpetual twilight. I'd been fighting a growing sense of unease since we'd turned off the main highway. It wasn't just my natural anxiety about camping. I was more of an indoor person, preferring the predictability of spreadsheets to the chaos of nature. There was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time I caught glimpses of the forest through the car windows. The trees seemed too still, too quiet. Even with the windows down, we should have heard birds singing, insects buzzing, the normal sounds of a healthy forest ecosystem. Instead, there was only an oppressive silence that seemed to press against our eardrums. Sarah navigated the increasingly rough roads with practiced ease, her SUV handling the rocks and ruts like she'd driven this route 100 times before. But I noticed her knuckles were white where she gripped the steering wheel, and she kept checking the rearview mirror as if expecting to see something following us. "How much further?" Jennifer asked from the back seat, her voice slightly strained. She'd been carsick for the last 20 minutes of winding mountain roads. "Almost there," Sarah replied, but her voice sounded tight. "Just another mile or so to the trailhead." The parking area, when we finally reached it, was nothing more than a small clearing where the gravel road ended abruptly against a wall of trees. A weathered wooden sign marked the beginning of the Devil's Den Trail, but the paint was so faded and peeled that it was almost impossible to read. Someone had carved additional words into the wood below the official trail marker, but they'd been scratched out so aggressively that only fragments were visible. Turn back, and what might have been not safe after. Charming, Kevin muttered, adjusting his brand-new hiking boots. He'd spent a fortune at REI the week before, convinced that expensive gear would somehow make up for his complete lack of outdoor experience. Mark was already unloading beer from his oversized backpack. Come on, guys, it's just a trail sign. Probably some teenagers trying to scare people. He cracked open a can and took a long drink. Besides, we've got Sarah here to guide us through the spooky forest, right, Sarah? But Sarah wasn't paying attention. She was staring into the trees beyond the trailhead, her face pale despite the warm October sunshine. We should get moving, she said abruptly. I want to reach the campsite while we still have plenty of daylight. The trail began innocuously enough, a well-worn path that wound gently upward through stands of oak and hickory. Our boots crunched through fallen leaves, and for the first time since leaving Springfield, I began to relax. This was just a normal hiking trail in a normal forest. Sarah had been right about the atmosphere. The autumn colors were spectacular, and there was something peaceful about being away from the constant buzz of office life. But as we climbed higher, the trail became narrower and less defined. The trees pressed closer on both sides, their branches intertwining overhead to block out more and more of the sky. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, even though the afternoon sun should have been at its warmest. And that unnatural silence continued, broken only by the sound of our own footsteps and increasingly labored breathing. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Kevin asked after we'd been hiking for almost an hour. He was already breathing hard and sweating through his moisture-wicking shirt. "This doesn't look like much of a trail anymore." Sarah paused and consulted her GPS device, frowning at the small screen. "That's weird. The signal keeps cutting in and out." She shook the device and held it up toward the canopy. Must be the tree cover interfering with the satellites. I pulled out my phone to check our location, but the screen showed no signal bars at all. "I'm not getting anything either. When's the last time any of you guys had cell service?" We all checked our phones. Nothing. Not even an emergency signal. "Well, that's just great," Mark said, though he didn't sound particularly concerned. "Guess we're really roughing it now. Sarah, you said you knew these woods, right? We don't need GPS to find your grandfather's old campsite." Sarah nodded, but I caught the uncertainty in her eyes. "Of course. It's just been a while since I've been up here. Everything looks different in the fall." She pointed ahead to where the trail seemed to fork around a massive boulder. "This way. I remember that rock." We followed her lead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Several times I turned around expecting to see someone following us on the trail, but there was never anyone there. Just the trees, pressing closer and closer, and that suffocating silence. The shadows were growing longer when we finally reached what Sarah claimed was our destination. The campsite was little more than a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a circle of blackened stones marking where previous campers had built fires. But there was something wrong with the place. Something that made my skin crawl the moment we stepped into the open space. The trees around the clearing were scarred with deep gouges, as if something with enormous claws had been sharpening them on the bark. The scratches were too high up to have been made by bears or any other normal woodland animal. They started about 8 feet off the ground and extended up another 4 or 5 feet, and they were fresh. Sap still oozed from some of the deeper cuts. "What the hell did that?" Jennifer whispered, dropping her backpack and staring up at the damaged trees. Mark laughed, but it sounded forced. "Probably just lightning damage. You know how weird lightning can be in the mountains." Kevin was examining the scratches more closely, running his fingers along the bark. "Lightning doesn't make parallel gouges like this. This looks like claw marks." "Could be a bear marking territory," Sarah said quickly. "Black bears are common in this area. They mark trees to show other bears their range." But I'd seen bear claw marks before, and these were nothing like them. Bears typically clawed trees at shoulder height, and their claws left broader, less precise marks. These gouges were thin and deep, made by something with razor-sharp talons and the reach of a creature much larger than any bear. Despite our unease about the claw marks, we set up camp as the sun began to sink toward the western ridgeline. Jennifer and I worked together to pitch our tents on the far side of the clearing from the scarred trees, while Mark and Kevin gathered deadfall for the fire. Sarah seemed distracted, constantly checking the tree line as if she expected something to emerge from the shadows. "You okay?" I asked her as we arranged stones around the fire pit. "You seem nervous." She forced a smile. "Just want to make sure everyone has a good time. This was my idea after all. I'd hate for anything to go wrong." There was something in her tone that suggested she was expecting something to go wrong, but before I could press her for details, Mark came crashing through the underbrush with an armload of firewood. "This place is awesome," he declared, dropping the wood with a loud clatter. "Found a whole grove of dead trees about 50 yards that way. We'll have enough firewood to keep a bonfire going all night." Kevin emerged from the opposite direction carrying a much smaller load of carefully selected branches. "Did anyone else notice how quiet it is out there? I mean, unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. It's like the forest is holding its breath." "It's just the change in seasons," Jennifer said, but her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. "Animals probably migrate through this area differently than in other places." As darkness fell, we huddled around our fire and tried to maintain the pretense that this was just a normal camping trip. Mark regaled us with stories from his college days, most of them involving alcohol and poor decision-making. Jennifer shared ghost stories she'd heard growing up in suburban Chicago. Kevin kept checking his phone for signal, as if the bars might magically reappear if he looked often enough. But Sarah remained largely silent, staring into the flames with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When she did speak, it was to ask strange questions. "Michael, did you tell anyone exactly where we were going this weekend?" I looked up from the can of chili I was heating over the fire. "I mentioned to my landlord that I'd be camping in Missouri. Why?" "Just curious. It's important that people know where you are when you're in remote areas like this." "Are you expecting trouble?" Kevin asked, his voice cracking slightly. Sarah's laugh was hollow. "Of course not. Just standard safety protocol." But I noticed she kept glancing toward the tree line, and her hand rested on the large hunting knife she wore on her belt. It seemed like an awfully big knife for simple camping tasks. Around 10 o'clock, as we were discussing sleeping arrangements and firewatch duties, we heard the first howl. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, a long, mournful sound that raised goosebumps on my arms and made the fire seem to flicker in response. The sound was too low and too sustained to be a wolf. Missouri didn't have wild wolves anyway, but it was too wild and primal to be a dog. "Coyote," Mark said immediately, but his voice was tight. "Probably just a coyote pack." Another howl answered the first, this one from a different direction, then another. They seemed to be moving around us, circling the campsite at a distance we couldn't calculate in the darkness. "That's not coyotes," Sarah said quietly. Her face was pale in the firelight and her hand was definitely gripping her knife now. "Coyotes don't howl like that." Kevin stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his camp chair. "Like what? What the hell are they?" Before Sarah could answer, the howling stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. At least when something was howling, we knew where it was. Now we were surrounded by darkness and the unknown. "Maybe we should take turns keeping watch," Jennifer suggested, "just to be safe." We agreed on 2-hour shifts, with Mark volunteering to take the first watch since he was the most confident about our safety. The rest of us retreated to our tents, but I doubt any of us actually slept. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to every sound: the crackle of the dying fire, Mark's footsteps as he paced around the campsite, the whisper of wind through the pine boughs overhead. But mostly, I listened to the silence, the complete, unnatural absence of sound that surrounded our small pocket of civilization. No owls hooting, no mice rustling through the leaves, no insects chirping. It was as if everything that belonged in the forest had fled, leaving only us and whatever was making those impossible howls. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, someone was shaking my shoulder. I opened my eyes to find Kevin crouched beside my tent, his face visible in the dim glow of the dying fire. "Mike, wake up. It's your turn for watch." I checked my phone. 2:17 a.m. "Everything quiet?" Kevin nodded, but his hands were shaking. "Yeah, too quiet. And Mike, there's something you should see." I crawled out of my sleeping bag and followed him to the fire pit, where he'd been maintaining a small flame. The light barely reached the edge of the clearing, but it was enough to see what had Kevin spooked. Footprints. Dozens of them, circling our campsite just beyond the reach of the firelight. But they weren't normal animal tracks. They looked almost human, but stretched and distorted, as if made by feet that were longer and narrower than any person's. The stride length suggested something with impossibly long legs, and the depth of the impressions indicated a creature much heavier than its footprint size would suggest. "They weren't here when Mark started his watch," Kevin whispered. "I've been checking the perimeter every few minutes. These showed up sometime in the last hour." I studied the tracks more closely, fighting down a surge of panic. The prints led in a complete circle around our camp, but they didn't approach any closer than about 20 feet from our tents. It was as if whatever made them had been testing our defenses, looking for weaknesses. "We should wake the others," I said. Kevin shook his head. "Mark's finally getting some sleep. Guy was wound tighter than a spring during his watch. And Sarah, I don't know, Mike. There's something about Sarah that doesn't add up. She knows more about this place than she's telling us." Before I could respond, we heard movement in the forest beyond the circle of tracks. Not the random rustling of wind through leaves, but purposeful, deliberate sounds. Something large was moving through the trees, circling us again, but staying just outside the range of our firelight. I grabbed a flashlight and started to point it toward the sounds, but Kevin caught my wrist. "Don't," he hissed. "Whatever's out there, I don't think we want to see it, and we definitely don't want it to see us clearly." We sat in tense silence for the next 2 hours, feeding the fire and listening to the sounds of whatever was stalking us through the darkness. Sometimes it seemed to be moving on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. Sometimes it made soft padding sounds like a large cat. Other times the heavy footfalls of something much more massive. But it never came close enough for us to see it clearly, never quite revealed itself despite our growing certainty that it was watching us. Dawn came slowly, filtered through the thick canopy of pines. As the gray light gradually replaced the absolute darkness, the sounds from the forest faded away. By the time the others began stirring in their tents, the woods seemed normal again, or as normal as they ever seemed in this strange, silent place. "How was your watch?" Sarah asked as she emerged from her tent. She looked like she hadn't slept at all, her hair disheveled and dark circles under her eyes. "Quiet," I lied, shooting a glance at Kevin. We'd agreed not to mention the footprints or the sounds unless something more concrete happened. No point in panicking everyone over what might have been normal forest animals. But Sarah wasn't buying it. Her eyes immediately went to the circle of tracks around our campsite, and I saw her face pale. "We need to pack up," she said abruptly. "Right now. We're leaving." Mark poked his head out of his tent. "What? Why? We just got here. I thought we were staying 2 nights. Change of plans. Weather's supposed to turn bad." Sarah was already stuffing gear into her backpack with frantic efficiency. Jennifer looked up at the clear blue sky visible through gaps in the canopy. "What weather? It's a beautiful morning. Trust me, we need to go. Now." There was something in Sarah's voice that brooked no argument. Within an hour, we had broken camp and were back on the trail, retracing our steps toward the parking area. But something was wrong with the path. What had seemed like a clear, if narrow, trail the day before now felt maze-like and confusing. We reached intersections that none of us remembered from the hike-in, and familiar landmarks seemed to have shifted position. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Jennifer asked after we'd been hiking for over an hour without reaching any recognizable features. Sarah consulted her GPS again, but the device seemed to be malfunctioning worse than the day before. The screen flickered between different readings, showing our position jumping wildly across the map, sometimes placing us miles from where we should be. "Technology doesn't work right out here," she muttered, more to herself than to us. "Never has. The land, it doesn't like to be mapped." Kevin stopped walking. "What did you say?" Sarah spun around, her face flushed. "Nothing. I didn't say anything important. Let's just keep moving." But Kevin wasn't backing down. "No, you said something about the land not liking to be mapped. What the hell does that mean, Sarah? What aren't you telling us about this place?" For a moment, I thought Sarah might continue to deflect, but then her shoulders sagged, and the careful mask she'd been wearing since we arrived finally slipped. "My grandfather didn't hunt here," she said quietly. "He warned me never to come here. Said it was cursed land, that there were things in these woods that shouldn't be disturbed." Mark laughed, but it sounded forced. "Cursed? Come on, Sarah. You're talking like a character in a horror movie." "My grandfather was Cherokee," Sarah continued, ignoring Mark's interruption. "He grew up hearing stories about this area from his elders. They called it the Hungry Place, said it was where the skinwalkers came from before the white settlers drove the tribes west." The word skinwalkers hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard the term before, read about them in books about Native American folklore. Shapeshifters, creatures that could take on the appearance of animals or humans but were fundamentally something else entirely. Something malevolent. "So, why did you bring us here?" Kevin demanded, his voice rising with panic. "If you knew this place was dangerous, why the hell did you lead us into it?" Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now. "Because it called to me. Ever since I was a little girl, I've been having dreams about this place. Dreams where something was calling my name, promising to show me wonders if I'd just come visit. The dreams got stronger after my grandfather died last year, like whatever was out here knew he wasn't around to protect me anymore." Jennifer was backing away from Sarah, her face pale with horror. "You brought us here as bait. You used us to—" She never finished the sentence. Something came crashing through the trees behind us, moving so fast it was just a blur of dark fur and impossible angles. Kevin screamed and dove to one side as the thing swept past him, its claws raking across his shoulder and sending him tumbling into the underbrush. I got my first clear look at it as it wheeled around for another attack. It was roughly the size and shape of a large wolf, but everything about it was wrong. Its legs were too long, its joints bent at angles that defied anatomy. Its fur was a mottled black and gray that seemed to shift and crawl as I watched, and its eyes were human, intelligent, malevolent. "Run!" Sarah screamed, but the creature was already moving again, this time toward Jennifer. She tried to dodge, but it moved with impossible speed and agility. Its jaws clamped down on her arm, and I heard bones break with a wet, sickening crunch. Jennifer's scream cut through the forest like a knife. The creature shook her like a rag doll before releasing her and disappearing back into the trees as suddenly as it had appeared. Jennifer collapsed to the ground, her right arm bent at an unnatural angle, blood soaking through her jacket. Mark was frozen in terror, his face white as paper. Kevin was struggling to stand, his own shoulder bleeding from deep claw marks, and Sarah. Sarah was sobbing, but not from fear, from what looked almost like relief. "It's here," she whispered. "It's finally here." I knelt beside Jennifer, trying to assess her injuries while keeping one eye on the trees around us. Her arm was definitely broken, possibly in multiple places, and she was going into shock from blood loss and trauma. "We have to get her to a hospital," I said. "Sarah, which way is the shortest route back to the car?" But Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring into the forest with a strange smile on her face, as if she was seeing something wonderful instead of the nightmare that had just attacked us. "Sarah," I shouted, "snap out of it. We need to move." She blinked and seemed to come back to herself, but there was still something off about her expression. "Yes, of course, this way." She started walking deeper into the forest, away from the direction we'd been traveling. "Wait!" Kevin called after her, struggling to support Jennifer's good side. "That's not the way we came. The parking area is back that way." Sarah turned around, and for just a moment her face looked completely blank. Empty. Then she smiled, but it was wrong somehow. Too wide. Too many teeth. "Trust me," she said in a voice that sounded like Sarah but felt like something else entirely. "I know these woods better than anyone." That's when I realized we'd been looking at this all wrong. The creature hadn't attacked us randomly. It had taken Jennifer specifically, injuring her badly enough that she couldn't move quickly, couldn't run. And now, Sarah, or whatever was wearing Sarah's face, was trying to lead us deeper into the forest. "Kevin," I said quietly, "can you carry Jennifer?" He nodded, understanding immediately. "What about Sarah?" I looked at the thing that looked like our co-worker, still smiling that horrible smile and waiting patiently for us to follow her deeper into the woods. That's not Sarah anymore. The thing that had been Sarah tilted its head to one side, like a predator studying prey. "Don't be silly, Michael. Of course I'm Sarah. Who else would I be?" But its voice was different now. Subtly wrong, as if it was having trouble remembering exactly how Sarah sounded. And its eyes. Sarah's eyes had been brown. These were yellow, with pupils that contracted to vertical slits in the daylight. Mark was still standing frozen, staring at the not Sarah with growing horror. "What happened to her face?" he whispered. I looked closer and saw what he meant. Sarah's features were shifting, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely changing. Her nose was becoming narrower, more pointed. Her ears were elongating. Her skin was taking on a grayish tint that reminded me of the creature's fur. "We need to go," I said urgently. "Right now. Kevin, can you manage Jennifer?" Kevin had already lifted Jennifer in a fireman's carry despite his own injured shoulder. She was unconscious now, which was probably a mercy given the extent of her injuries. "Which way?" he asked. I tried to orient myself based on the position of the sun and the general slope of the land. We'd been walking uphill most of the way in, so downhill should take us back toward the trailhead. I hoped. "Downhill. Follow the drainage." We started moving, leaving the Sarah thing standing alone in the clearing. It didn't try to follow us immediately, just watched with those yellow eyes as we crashed through the underbrush, but I could hear it moving parallel to our path, staying just out of sight but close enough that we knew it was there. Mark was struggling to keep up, his office worker physique no match for the rough terrain and his terror-induced adrenaline crash. "What was that thing?" he panted. "What happened to Sarah?" "Skinwalker," I said grimly. "Sarah was right about the old stories. This place is cursed." "That's impossible. Those are just legends, folklore. They're not real." I gestured toward Kevin's bleeding shoulder and Jennifer's mangled arm. "Tell that to them." We made it perhaps half a mile before the attacks began in earnest. The first one came from above. Something dropped from the trees onto Mark's back, driving him to the ground with inhuman strength. He screamed as claws raked across his scalp, and I got a glimpse of something that might once have been human, but was now something else entirely. Its arms were too long, its fingers ending in razor-sharp talons, and its face was a nightmare fusion of human and animal features. I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the creature's head, connecting with a wet thud that sent it tumbling off Mark's back. But instead of fleeing or falling unconscious, it immediately leaped to its feet and hissed at me, revealing a mouthful of needle-sharp teeth. "Kevin, keep moving," I shouted. "Get Jennifer out of here." The skinwalker lunged at me, moving with inhuman speed. I barely managed to get the branch up in time to block its claws, and the impact sent shockwaves up my arms. Whatever this thing was, it was much stronger than it looked. Behind me, I could hear Mark whimpering and Kevin's labored breathing as he carried Jennifer's unconscious form through the forest. The skinwalker circled me like a predator, making soft, chittering sounds that might have been laughter. Then it spoke, and I nearly dropped my makeshift weapon in shock. "Michael." It was Sarah's voice coming from that twisted, inhuman throat. "Why are you running from me? I thought we were friends." "You're not, Sarah," I said, raising the branch defensively. The thing smiled with too many teeth. "Of course I am. Don't you recognize me?" As I watched in horror, its features began to shift and flow, becoming more recognizably human. Within moments, it looked exactly like Sarah again, except for those terrible yellow eyes. "Sarah trusted me," it continued in her voice. "She came to me willingly. She'd been dreaming about me for years, you know. All I had to do was call, and she led you right to me." "What did you do to her?" "What I'd do to all of them, eventually. I took her shape, her memories, her voice. She's still in here somewhere, screaming." It tapped the side of its head with one clawed finger. "Would you like to say goodbye?" For a moment, its voice changed, becoming higher, more desperate. "Michael, run! Don't let it—" Then the skinwalker's voice returned, cutting off whatever Sarah had been trying to say. I swung the branch with all my strength, aiming for its head. But the creature was faster than anything had a right to be. It ducked under the swing and raked its claws across my thigh, sending spikes of agony up my leg. I stumbled and fell, the branch rolling away into the underbrush. The skinwalker stood over me, savoring its victory. "I think I'll keep you alive for a while," it said thoughtfully. "Your friends are getting away, and I might need your voice to call them back." It reached down toward my face with one clawed hand, and I was certain I was about to die. But before it could touch me, something heavy crashed into it from the side, sending both creatures tumbling into a nearby tree. It was Kevin. He'd managed to get Jennifer to safety and come back for me, armed with a thick piece of deadfall. The skinwalker snarled and turned on him, but Kevin was ready. He brought the makeshift club down on its skull with a sickening crack, and the creature collapsed. "Is it dead?" I asked, struggling to stand despite the deep cuts in my leg. Kevin prodded the motionless form with his club. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here before it wakes up or more of them show up." He helped me to my feet, and we limped through the forest toward where he'd left Jennifer. She was still unconscious, propped against a tree trunk, her face pale but her breathing steady. "How far to the parking area?" Kevin asked. I tried to orient myself again, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed identical, and the canopy was so thick that I could barely see the sky. "I have no idea. We're lost." That's when we heard the howling start again. Multiple voices this time coming from all directions, and some of them sounded human. "Michael." Sarah's voice drifted through the trees, but now I could hear the wrongness in it, the subtle, inhuman undertones. "Kevin, where are you? I'm hurt. I need help." Another voice joined hers, Mark's voice, calling out in apparent pain and terror. "Guys, help me. Something's got me. I'm over here." But Mark was sitting right next to us, his scalp wounds bandaged with strips torn from his shirt. He looked as terrified as I felt. "That's not me," he whispered. "Jesus Christ, that's not me calling." The voices continued, becoming more urgent, more desperate. Sarah pleading for help, Mark screaming in agony. Even Jennifer's voice joined the chorus, though she was right there beside us, still unconscious. "They're trying to lure us toward them," Kevin said grimly, "using our own voices against us." "How many of them are there?" "I don't think they're separate creatures. I think it's all the same thing, the same skinwalker, shifting between different forms. But it can only maintain one complete form at a time. That's why the voices sound wrong when it's not fully committed to a particular shape." The howling was getting closer, and now we could hear movement through the underbrush. Multiple sources of sound, all converging on our position. "We have to move," I said. "Jennifer or no Jennifer, we can't stay here." Kevin nodded and lifted Jennifer again, despite his obvious exhaustion and his injured shoulder. "Which way?" I pointed toward what I hoped was downhill. "That way. And if we get separated, keep going downhill until you hit a road or a stream. Don't stop for anything." We started moving again, crashing through the forest with as much speed as we could manage while carrying an unconscious person. Behind us, the voices continued their terrible chorus, but now they were angry rather than pleading. "You can't escape," Sarah's voice snarled. "This is my forest. I know every tree, every rock, every shadow. You'll never find your way out." Mark's voice joined in. "I'm going to wear your faces, Michael. I'm going to walk around in your skins and visit your families. They'll never know what happened to the real you." But even as the threats continued, the voices seemed to be falling behind. Whatever the Skinwalker's abilities, it apparently couldn't track us as easily when we were moving unpredictably through dense forest. We stumbled through the woods for what felt like hours, always heading downhill, always listening for the sound of pursuit. Jennifer regained consciousness once, long enough to scream when she saw her mangled arm, but then mercifully passed out again. The sun was getting low in the sky when we finally heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Traffic. Cars passing on a road somewhere ahead of us. "Thank God," Kevin breathed. "We made it." We crashed through the last line of trees and found ourselves on a narrow paved road. Not the gravel road that led to the trailhead, but some other route entirely. We were definitely lost, but we were out of the forest. A pickup truck came around the bend just as we reached the asphalt. The driver, an elderly man in overalls, took one look at our bloody, battered group and immediately pulled over. "What in Sam Hill happened to you folks?" he asked, jumping out of the truck. "Camping accident," I said quickly. "Our friend needs medical attention." The man, who introduced himself as Earl Patterson, helped us load Jennifer into the truck bed and drove us to the nearest hospital, which turned out to be an eminence, about 30 miles from where we'd intended to camp. The doctors and nurses at the small rural hospital did their best with Jennifer's injuries, but she needed surgery that was beyond their capabilities. They stabilized her and arranged for a helicopter to transport her to a trauma center in Springfield. Kevin's shoulder needed stitches, as did the cuts on my leg and Mark's scalp. The doctor who treated us was curious about our story, particularly when he noticed that all of our injuries looked like animal attacks. "Must have been a hell of a camping trip," Dr. Morrison said as he cleaned my wounds. "What kind of animal did you say attacked you?" "We never got a good look at it," I lied. "Happened too fast." Dr. Morrison raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. "Well, you're lucky to be alive. We've had a few unusual incidents in these woods over the years. Most folks don't make it out in as good a shape as you did." After we were patched up, the local sheriff's department wanted statements about what had happened. We stuck to our story about a bear attack and getting lost in the woods. They seemed satisfied with the explanation, though I noticed the deputy taking our statements seemed nervous when we mentioned Devil's Den. "That area's been closed to camping for the past 5 years," he said. "Too many incidents. People going missing, strange animal attacks, that sort of thing. You folks are lucky you made it out." "Closed?" Kevin asked. "But there were trail markers, a parking area." The deputy shrugged. "Markers from before the closure. State hasn't gotten around to removing them yet. Budget cuts, you know." We spent the night in a motel in Eminence, each of us in our own room, all of us too shaken to sleep much. Mark broke down completely around midnight, sobbing about how something had been wearing his voice, using it to hunt us. Kevin spent the night researching Skinwalker legends on his laptop, trying to understand what we'd encountered. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Sarah, the real Sarah, who'd been trapped inside that thing, trying to warn us even as it used her face to hunt us down. I wondered if she was still alive in there somewhere, or if the creature had finally consumed everything that made her human. In the morning, we drove back to Springfield in Earl Patterson's nephew's car. The old man had refused to accept any payment for helping us, just asked us to stay out of those woods from now on. We picked up our own vehicles from the office parking lot where we'd left them and went our separate ways. Jennifer spent 3 weeks in the hospital and underwent multiple surgeries to rebuild her arm. She was lucky. The doctors managed to save full function, though she'll always have scars. She quit her job at Midwest Financial Solutions and moved back to Chicago to be closer to her family. She never talks about what happened in the forest. Kevin became obsessed with researching skinwalker legends and similar phenomena. He's convinced that there are more of these creatures out there, hiding in remote areas across the country. He quit his IT job and now works for some kind of paranormal research organization. I get emails from him occasionally, usually containing links to news stories about mysterious disappearances in national forests. Mark had a complete nervous breakdown. He's been in therapy for months, dealing with what his psychiatrist calls severe PTSD with auditory hallucinations. He keeps hearing his own voice calling to him from empty rooms and shadowy corners. Sometimes he calls me at 3 a.m, crying, asking me to confirm that it's really him talking and not something else using his voice. As for me, I moved out of Missouri, transferred to our company's Denver office, and bought a house in a subdivision where the nearest tree is a decorative maple in someone's front yard. I don't go camping anymore. I don't even like being outdoors after dark. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear Sarah's voice calling my name from somewhere outside my window. It sounds exactly like her, frightened and desperate, begging for help. And every time I hear it, I have to remind myself that Sarah is gone. That whatever is out there wearing her voice isn't really her. The thing that haunts me most isn't the physical horror of what we saw in those woods. It's the knowledge that Sarah had been dreaming about that place for years, that something had been calling to her, manipulating her, leading her to bring us there as prey. How long had it been planning? How many other people had it lured into those woods over the years? And the worst thought of all, what if it's not confined to Devil's Den? What if there are others like it, scattered across the wilderness areas of America, calling to people in their dreams, waiting patiently for new victims to walk into their territory? I've started having dreams myself lately, dreams about a different forest, somewhere in Colorado. Mountains and pine trees and something calling my name from the shadows, promising to show me wonders if I'll just come visit. I wake up in a cold sweat every time, but the dreams are getting stronger, more vivid, more compelling. And sometimes when I'm driving home from work through the foothills west of Denver, I find myself taking unfamiliar exits, following mountain roads that seem to lead deeper and deeper into the wilderness. I always catch myself and turn around, but each time it gets a little harder to resist the pull. Last week, I started researching remote camping areas in the Colorado Rockies. Just out of curiosity, I told myself, just to see what's out there. But I know the truth. It's starting again. Something else has found me. Something that learned about me from the creature in Missouri. They communicate somehow, these things. They share information about prey. And sooner or later, despite everything I know about what happened to Sarah, despite all my precautions and fears, I'm going to get in my car and drive into those mountains. Because the calling is getting stronger every day, and I can feel my resistance wearing down. The dreams are so vivid now, so beautiful, and the voice that calls to me sounds so familiar, so trustworthy. It sounds exactly like my own voice, calling to me from the darkness, promising that everything will be wonderful if I'll just come home to the forest where I belong. But I know what that means now. I know that when something starts calling to you in your own voice, it's already too late. The skinwalkers have found me again, and this time, I don't think I'm going to be able to resist. My name is Kevin King, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Bell Mountain Wilderness area of Missouri's Mark Twain National Forest 3 weeks ago. Brandon Edwards and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd both been grinding at our desk jobs in Springfield, him in accounting, me in IT, and desperately needed to disconnect from civilization. The Bell Mountain Wilderness seemed perfect, 9,000 acres of pristine Ozark forest where cell towers couldn't reach and the nearest road was miles away. "You sure about this spot?" Brandon asked as we hiked deeper into the forest on that first afternoon. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the October chill. He'd always been the cautious one, double-checking our gear 3 times before we left. "Trust me," I said, adjusting my heavy pack. "My uncle used to hunt these hills. Said there's a perfect clearing about 2 miles past Shut-In Creek where nobody ever goes." The trail had long since disappeared beneath fallen leaves and overgrown brush. Ancient oaks and hickories formed a canopy so thick that even at 3 in the afternoon, the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. Every few steps, something would rustle in the underbrush, causing Brandon to flinch and scan the shadows. "Probably just squirrels," I told him, though I was starting to feel uneasy myself. The forest was too quiet. No birds singing, no insects buzzing. Just the soft crunch of our boots on decaying leaves and the distant sound of running water. We found the clearing just as my uncle had described, a perfect circle of grass surrounded by towering trees, with Shut-In Creek running along the eastern edge. The water was crystal clear, bubbling over smooth limestone rocks. It would have been beautiful if not for the strange feeling that we were being watched. "This'll do," Brandon said, dropping his pack with obvious relief. "Though it's weird how perfectly round this clearing is, almost like it was made on purpose." I helped him set up our tents on opposite sides of the clearing, giving us both some privacy. As we worked, I noticed peculiar scratches on several of the surrounding trees, deep gouges in the bark about 7 feet off the ground, as if something with massive claws had marked its territory. "Check this out," I called Brandon over to examine the scratches. He ran his fingers along the gouges, his face growing pale. "These are fresh, and look at the spacing. Whatever made these had to be huge." "Probably just a black bear," I said, though the scratches seemed too uniform, too deliberate. "They're all over these mountains." Brandon didn't look convinced, but we continued setting up camp. As the sun began to set behind the trees, I built a fire in the center of the clearing while Brandon prepared our dinner, freeze-dried stroganoff that tasted like cardboard but filled our stomachs. The temperature dropped rapidly once darkness fell. I added more wood to the fire, but the flames seemed strangely subdued, casting weak, flickering light that barely reached the edge of our camp. Beyond that ring of firelight, the forest was absolutely black. "Jesus, it's dark out here," Brandon muttered, pulling his jacket tighter. "I can't even see the trees anymore." He was right. The darkness beyond our fire seemed solid, impenetrable. I'd been camping dozens of times, but I'd never experienced anything like this. It was as if the night had weight, pressing down on us from all sides. "Good thing we brought plenty of batteries for the flashlights," I said, trying to lighten the mood. But when Brandon clicked his on, the beam seemed to die just a few feet from the lens, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Mine did the same thing. "That's not normal," he said, clicking the flashlight off and on repeatedly. "I just put in fresh batteries." A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. We both froze, staring into the black wall of forest. "Probably just the wood settling," I whispered, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. Then we heard it. A sound like breathing, deep and raspy, coming from the trees directly behind Brandon's tent. He grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it toward the sound, but the makeshift torch provided no more illumination than our flashlights. "There's something out there," Brandon hissed. "I can hear it moving." The breathing continued for several minutes, circling our camp just outside the ring of firelight. Occasionally, we'd hear the soft pad of footsteps on the forest floor, but never in rhythm with the breathing. It was as if multiple things were moving around us. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sounds stopped. The forest returned to its unnatural silence. "Maybe we should pack up and hike back," Brandon suggested. "Something doesn't feel right about this place." In the dark, with whatever that was still out there? I shook my head. We'd never find the trail. Better to wait until morning. Brandon nodded reluctantly, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We decided to take turns keeping watch, feeding the fire and listening for any signs of danger. I took the first shift while Brandon retreated to his tent. The fire seemed to grow weaker as the night progressed, no matter how much wood I added. The flames would flicker and dance, occasionally changing from their normal orange to an unsettling blue-green color that made the shadows writhe like living things. Around midnight, I heard Brandon calling my name from his tent. "Kevin! Kevin, you need to see this." His voice sounded strange, too flat, too emotionless. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled over to his tent. "Brandon, what's wrong?" "Just come inside. You need to see." I unzipped the entrance and poked my head through. Brandon was sitting cross-legged in his sleeping bag, staring at the tent wall with a blank expression. His eyes were wide and unblinking, reflecting the weak light from my flashlight like an animal's. "What am I supposed to be looking at?" I asked. He turned his head toward me with mechanical precision, his neck rotating further than seemed anatomically possible. When he smiled, I noticed his teeth looked sharper than I remembered. "Can't you see them?" he whispered. "They're beautiful." I followed his gaze to the tent wall but saw only the orange nylon fabric. "See what, Brandon?" "The symbols. They're writing messages on the wall. They want us to join them." My blood went cold. There was nothing on the tent wall, just a smooth fabric. But Brandon was staring at it with the intensity of someone watching the most fascinating thing in the world. "Brandon, there's nothing there. You're probably just tired. Why don't you try to get some sleep?" He continued staring at the wall for a moment longer, then suddenly blinked and looked at me with confusion. "Kevin, when did you get in here? I thought you were keeping watch." The normal Brandon was back, confused, tired, but recognizably himself. "You called me over, said you needed to show me something." "I did?" He rubbed his eyes. "I don't remember that. I must have been having a weird dream." I studied his face carefully. He seemed genuinely confused, not like he was pretending. "Are you feeling okay? You were acting really strange." "Just tired, I guess. This place is getting to me." He lay down in his sleeping bag. "Wake me when it's my turn to watch." I returned to the fire but couldn't shake the image of Brandon's eyes reflecting the light like an animal's, or the way his neck had turned too far. I told myself it was just exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the forest playing tricks on my perception. The rest of my watch passed uneventfully, though I kept hearing subtle sounds from the darkness, the soft rustle of movement, the occasional snap of a twig, and once, what sounded like whispering voices just beyond the edge of hearing. I woke Brandon at 3 a.m. for his shift. He seemed normal again, complaining about the cold and asking if I'd heard anything unusual. I decided not to mention his strange behavior in the tent. "Just keep the fire going," I told him, "and wake me if you hear anything weird." I retreated to my own tent, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brandon's face from earlier, that blank stare and those reflective eyes, and there was something else bothering me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then it hit me. When Brandon had turned his head in the tent, I hadn't heard the usual soft pops and cracks that come with turning your neck. His movement had been completely silent, as if his bones and joints were no longer connected the way they should be. I was still thinking about this when I heard Brandon calling from outside. "Kevin, Kevin, get out here." His voice was urgent but not panicked. I unzipped my tent and crawled out to find him standing by the fire, staring into the darkness. "What is it?" I asked. "Look." He pointed toward the forest. "Do you see the lights?" I followed his gaze but saw only impenetrable blackness. "What lights?" "They're dancing between the trees, little points of blue light moving in patterns." His voice had that same flat quality from earlier. "They want us to follow them." I grabbed his shoulder and turned him to face me. In the firelight, his pupils were dilated so wide that his eyes looked completely black. "Brandon, there are no lights out there. Look at me. Focus on my voice." He stared at me for a moment, then blinked hard several times. When he looked at me again, his pupils had returned to normal size. "Sorry, I thought I saw something. Must be more tired than I thought." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Maybe we should both stay awake until morning. I don't think I'm in any shape to keep watch alone." We spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, taking turns adding wood and trying to make conversation. But every few minutes, Brandon would stop mid-sentence and stare into the darkness with that blank expression, as if something was calling to him. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. As the first pale light began filtering through the trees, the oppressive feeling that had surrounded us all night seemed to lift slightly. The forest looked normal again, just trees and undergrowth and the clear water of Shut-In Creek. "Thank God," Brandon said, stretching his stiff muscles. "I thought this night would never end." "How are you feeling?" I asked, studying his face in the growing daylight. "Better. Clearer. I think the darkness was messing with my head." He stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. "You know what? I'm not ready to leave yet. This place is beautiful in the daylight, and we only packed for 2 nights anyway." I wasn't sure I agreed, but the morning sun was warming the air and the forest did look less threatening. Maybe our fears from the night before had been just that, fears magnified by darkness and an unfamiliar environment. "All right," I said, "but tonight we double-check our gear and make sure we have plenty of firewood." We spent the morning exploring the area around our camp. Brandon seemed back to his normal self, pointing out interesting plants and rock formations, collecting smooth stones from the creek. We found the remnants of an old logging road about a quarter-mile north of our camp, just twin ruts grown over with saplings, but it made me feel better to know there was a potential escape route. For lunch, we cooked hot dogs over the fire and heated a can of beans. Brandon was telling a story about a disastrous camping trip from his college years when he suddenly stopped talking and tilted his head to one side. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I listened carefully but heard only the normal sounds of the forest. Birds singing, wind in the leaves, the babble of the creek. "Hear what?" "Drums. Really faint, but definitely drums." He stood and walked toward the southern edge of the clearing, coming from that direction. I followed him but couldn't hear anything unusual. "Brandon, I don't hear any drums." He stood perfectly still for several minutes, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. When he finally looked at me, there was something different about his expression, a vacant quality that reminded me of the night before. "They're calling us," he said. "We should go to them." "Who's calling us? Brandon, you're starting to scare me." He blinked several times and the vacant look disappeared. "Sorry, God, I keep doing that, don't I? It's like something's in my head, making me see and hear things." "Maybe we should head back to town," I suggested. "You might be having some kind of reaction to something in the forest. Pollen or spores or something?" "No." His response was immediate and firm. "No, I'm fine. It's just the adjustment to being away from the city. My mind is still wired for constant stimulation, you know? This much quiet and isolation is making it play tricks on me." He seemed so certain, so rational, that I agreed to stay another night, but I made a mental note to watch him carefully. The afternoon passed peacefully. We hiked along Shut-In Creek for a couple of miles, finding deep pools where we could see trout darting through the clear water. Brandon seemed completely normal during this time, laughing, joking, acting like the friend I'd known for 5 years. But as evening approached and the shadows began to lengthen, I noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He would pause mid-conversation and stare off into the forest with that blank expression. When I called his name, it would take several seconds for him to respond, as if he was being called back from somewhere far away. "I think I'll gather some firewood before it gets dark," he said as we returned to camp. "I'll come with you." No, you start dinner. I'll just grab some dead branches from that area we passed." He pointed toward a section of forest where several trees had been knocked down, probably by a storm. "Don't go too far," I called after him as he disappeared into the trees. I started preparing our evening meal, more freeze-dried food and instant coffee. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I called Brandon's name, but got no response. After 45 minutes, I began to worry. I grabbed my flashlight and followed his path into the forest, calling his name every few steps. I found him standing in a small clearing about 100 yards from our camp. He was facing away from me, perfectly motionless with an armload of firewood at his feet. When I approached, I could see that he was staring at a massive oak tree whose trunk was covered in the same deep scratches we'd seen the day before. "Brandon, what are you doing?" He didn't respond. I walked around to face him and felt my stomach drop. His eyes were completely black. No iris, no white, just solid black from corner to corner. His mouth was slightly open, and I could hear a low humming sound coming from his throat. "Brandon!" I shook his shoulder hard. He blinked and his eyes returned to normal. "Kevin, how long have I been standing here?" "Almost an hour. You were supposed to be gathering firewood." He looked down at the wood scattered around his feet, then back at me with genuine confusion. I remember walking into the forest, and then nothing. Like I just woke up here. This is the third time today you've blanked out like this. Something's seriously wrong. "I know." His voice was shaky now, frightened. It's like something else is taking over my mind, and when it happens, I can't control what I'm doing or saying. We gathered the firewood and returned to camp, but the atmosphere between us had changed. Brandon kept glancing at me nervously, as if he was afraid of what he might do next. "Maybe I should sleep in your tent tonight," he suggested as we ate dinner. "If something's happening to me, you can wake me up before it gets too bad." I agreed, though privately I was considering whether we should try to hike out in the darkness. The strange episodes were becoming more frequent and more intense, but Brandon seemed lucid now, genuinely concerned about his condition, and I didn't want to abandon him. We arranged our sleeping bags side by side in my tent. Brandon fell asleep quickly, but I lay awake listening to his breathing and watching for any signs of the weird behavior. Around midnight, I heard him whisper my name. "Kevin. Kevin, are you awake?" "Yeah, what's wrong?" "I can see them now. They're beautiful." I turned on my flashlight and saw that Brandon was sitting up in his sleeping bag, staring at the tent wall with that same blank expression from the night before. But this time, his neck was twisted at an impossible angle, turned almost completely backwards so he could stare at the wall behind us. "Brandon, your neck." "They're writing their names on the wall," he continued in that flat, emotionless voice. "They want me to write mine too." I followed his gaze to the tent wall and felt my heart stop. There, scratched into the fabric in letters that definitely hadn't been there before, were words. "Come to us, join the hunt, we are waiting." The scratches looked fresh, as if they'd been carved just moments ago, but Brandon's hands were both visible, resting on top of his sleeping bag. "Who's writing this, Brandon?" He turned to look at me, and I saw that his eyes were black again, but this time, there was something else different about his face. His features seemed wrong somehow, the proportions slightly off, as if someone was wearing a mask of Brandon's face but couldn't get it to fit quite right. "We are," he said in a voice that wasn't quite his own. It was deeper, with an odd echoing quality. "We have been waiting so long for visitors. This one's mind is weak, easy to enter." "What are you?" The thing wearing Brandon's face smiled, and I saw that his teeth were now pointed like a predator's. "We are the original inhabitants of this forest. Before the European settlers, before the natives, we were here. Hunting, feeding. We have been hungry for so long." I scrambled for the tent zipper, but found it sealed shut as if the metal had fused together. The walls of the tent began to bow inward, shrinking the space around us. "Brandon, if you're still in there, you need to fight this thing." The Brandon thing laughed. "He cannot hear you. He is deep in our memories now, experiencing the hunts of centuries past. Soon, he will forget his human life entirely." The tent continued to shrink, forcing me closer to the creature. Its smell was overwhelming, like rotting meat and wet earth. When it breathed, I could see that its mouth extended much further back than a human mouth should, filled with rows of sharp teeth. "What do you want?" "To feed, to hunt. We have not tasted human flesh in decades." It reached toward me with hands that were too long, fingers that bent at wrong angles. "This one will help us catch the others." "What others? We're alone out here." "No, others will come. hikers, hunters, families with children. The thing's face shifted and changed as it spoke, sometimes looking like Brandon, sometimes like something else entirely. This one will call to them. His voice will seem familiar, trustworthy. They will follow him deep into the forest where we wait. I pressed myself against the back wall of the tent, which was now only a few feet away. Let him go. Take me instead. We will take you both, but this one's mind is more compatible, weaker, more easily broken. The tent wall behind me suddenly gave way and I tumbled backward into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward where our fire should have been, but the clearing was gone. I was surrounded by dense forest on all sides. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had been Brandon calling my name in his normal voice. "Kevin! Kevin, where are you? Something's wrong with the tent." I wanted to turn back, to help my friend, but I knew it wasn't really him anymore. I crashed through the underbrush, following what I hoped was the direction of the old logging road we'd found earlier. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I ran. Several times I tripped over fallen logs and went sprawling, but I forced myself to keep moving. Behind me, I could hear footsteps. Too many footsteps, as if several things were following me. "Kevin!" Brandon's voice called from multiple directions. "Kevin, why are you running? Come back, I'm hurt." The voices were coming from all around me now, echoing through the forest. Sometimes they sounded exactly like Brandon, sometimes like other people, men, women, children, all calling my name, all pleading for help. I stumbled onto what felt like the old logging road and followed it north, hoping it would eventually lead to a real road. The voices continued to follow me, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but never stopping. As dawn began to break, I finally reached a paved road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver, a local man named Jim, took one look at my torn clothes and bloody scratches and drove me straight to the sheriff's office in the nearest town. I told them everything, about Brandon's strange behavior, about the creature that had taken his place, about the voices in the forest. They listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. To them, I was just another city boy who'd gotten spooked in the woods and abandoned his friend. They organized a search party that included park rangers, local volunteers, and 2 tracking dogs. I led them back to where I thought our camp had been, but we never found the clearing. The GPS coordinates I'd marked on my phone showed nothing but dense forest. The searchers found some of our gear scattered along Shut-In Creek, my sleeping bag, Brandon's backpack, some cooking equipment, but no sign of Brandon himself and no trace of the campsite where we'd spent 2 nights. "Sometimes people just get lost out there," the sheriff told me. "The Ozarks can be disorienting, especially at night. He might have wandered off confused and fallen into a ravine or gotten turned around. We'll keep looking." But I knew they wouldn't find him. Or rather, they wouldn't find the Brandon who had gone into the forest with me. The official search continued for 2 weeks before being called off. Brandon Edwards was classified as a missing person, presumed dead. His family held a memorial service that I attended, sitting in the back row and saying nothing about what I'd really seen in the tent that night. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been monitoring local news from the area around Bell Mountain Wilderness. 2 weeks after our trip, a family of 4 disappeared while hiking in the same general area. Their car was found at a trailhead, but no trace of them was ever discovered. Last week, a solo hiker reported being approached by a friendly man who offered to guide him to a perfect camping spot. The hiker said something felt wrong about the man's appearance and mannerisms, so he declined and hiked back to his car. He described the man as having Brandon's general build and hair color. The thing in the forest was right. Others are coming. And Brandon, or what's left of him, is calling to them with a familiar, trustworthy voice. I've tried to warn the Park Service, but they think I'm just a traumatized survivor dealing with survivor's guilt. They've suggested I see a therapist to help process Brandon's accidental death. I think about driving back to Missouri, to Bell Mountain Wilderness, to try to find Brandon and somehow save him. But I know it's too late. Whatever was left of my friend's mind after that second night has probably been completely consumed by now. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I get phone calls from a number I don't recognize. When I answer, I hear Brandon's voice. "Kevin, Kevin, where are you? I'm still out here. I'm hurt and I need help. Please come back for me." The voice sounds exactly like him. The same inflection, the same slight rasp he got when he was tired. But there's something underneath it. Something hungry and patient and very, very old. I don't answer those calls anymore. I've changed my number twice, but somehow they still come through. Last night the voice was different. It wasn't just Brandon anymore. It was the missing family too. All of them calling my name. All of them asking me to come back to the forest. I'm writing this down because I need people to know what really happened to Brandon Edwards. If you're planning to camp or hike in the Bell Mountain Wilderness area, especially anywhere near Shut-In Creek, please don't go alone. And if you meet a friendly man who offers to show you a perfect camping spot, run. The creatures that live in that forest have been hungry for a very long time, and now they have voices to call with. Familiar, trustworthy voices that sound like people you might want to help. I keep the phone calls as voice recordings now, just in case. Maybe someday someone will believe me. Maybe someday they'll be able to do something about the things that hunt in the darkness between the trees. But until then, Brandon Edwards remains officially missing, and I remain the only witness to what really took him. The forest is still waiting, still calling, still hungry. And sometimes in my nightmares, I find myself walking back toward that perfectly round clearing, drawn by voices I recognize, voices I trust, voices that promise everything will be fine if I just come a little closer to the trees. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Mark Twain National Forest, deep in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri, where the trees grow so thick that daylight struggles to reach the forest floor even at noon. I should have known something was wrong when my phone died on the drive up, despite having a full charge when we left St. Louis. Tyler Bailey, my college roommate and closest friend, laughed it off as we pulled into the gravel parking area near Bell Mountain Wilderness. "Come on, Mike," he said, shouldering his pack with that easy grin that had gotten us both into and out of trouble since freshman year. "When's the last time you went anywhere without that thing glued to your hand? This is exactly what we need." Tyler was right in a way. After 6 months of unemployment and the slow dissolution of my relationship with Amanda, I needed to get away from everything. The plan was simple. 3 days of hiking and camping in one of Missouri's most remote wilderness areas, far from cell towers and civilization. Just 2 guys, some basic gear, and 8,000 acres of pristine forest. What we found instead was something that still wakes me up screaming 3 months later. The first day started well enough. We parked at the Bell Mountain trailhead around noon, signed the register, and headed into the woods. Tyler had done his research. Bell Mountain was known for its challenging terrain and relative isolation. The nearest town, Potosi, was over an hour's drive away, and the deep valleys and steep ridges made cell service non-existent. Perfect for a digital detox, Tyler had said when he planned the trip. He was a software engineer, always stressed about deadlines and code reviews. This was supposed to be his chance to unwind. The trail was well marked initially, winding through dense stands of oak and hickory. October in Missouri meant the leaves were turning, painting the forest in brilliant reds and golds. For the first few hours, it felt like exactly what we both needed. We talked about everything and nothing. Old college stories, Tyler's upcoming promotion, my job prospects. By late afternoon, we'd covered about 8 miles and found a clearing near what the map indicated was Crane Pond. The clearing was larger than I'd expected, maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by towering oaks that must have been centuries old. Their branches formed an almost perfect canopy overhead, with just enough gaps to let in scattered beams of golden afternoon light. "This is perfect," Tyler said, dropping his pack. "Far enough from the trail that we won't have any company." We set up camp efficiently. Tyler had insisted we practice in my backyard before the trip. 2 single tents, a shared cooking area, and a fire ring built from stones we gathered from a nearby creek. By the time we had everything arranged, the sun was starting to set, and the forest was beginning to take on that hushed quality that comes with approaching darkness. That's when I first noticed the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was the complete absence of sound. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no distant traffic hum. Even the wind seemed to have died completely. The only sounds were our own movements and the occasional crack of settling wood in the fire Tyler was building. "Weird," I muttered, looking around the clearing. "What's weird?" Tyler asked, not looking up from arranging kindling. "Listen." Tyler paused, head cocked. After a moment, he shrugged. "So, it's quiet. That's kind of the point, isn't it?" I wanted to explain that this felt different, wrong somehow, but I couldn't find the words. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. Dinner was simple. Dehydrated camping meals rehydrated over Tyler's camp stove. We ate by firelight, the flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. As full darkness settled over the clearing, those shadows seemed to move independently, shifting and writhing at the edge of our vision. "Remember senior year?" Tyler said, poking at the fire with a stick. "When we got lost trying to find that party at Miller's farm?" "We weren't lost," I protested. "We were geographically challenged." "Dude, we drove around for 3 hours. You kept insisting the GPS was wrong." "The GPS was wrong. Miller's farm wasn't where it was supposed to be." Tyler laughed, the sound unusually loud in the oppressive quiet. "Everything's where it's supposed to be, Mike. Sometimes we're just looking in the wrong place." Something about the way he said it made me glance at him sharply, but his expression was normal. The same easy grin, the same familiar features lit by firelight. I was being paranoid. We stayed up until almost midnight, feeding the fire and talking. The silence around us never broke. No owl calls, no distant howls, nothing. It was like we existed in a bubble of life surrounded by dead emptiness. When we finally crawled into our tents, I lay awake for a long time, listening to Tyler's steady breathing from 10 feet away. The darkness outside my tent was absolute, the kind of black that seemed to press against the thin nylon walls. Every few minutes I thought I heard something moving in the woods, a soft footfall, the whisper of fabric against bark. But whenever I held my breath to listen more carefully, there was nothing. I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke to the sound of Tyler unzipping his tent. According to my watch, it was 3:17 a.m. The fire had died to glowing embers, casting barely enough light to see his silhouette as he stood up. "Tyler," I whispered. He didn't respond. I watched through my tent's mesh window as he walked to the edge of the clearing, moving with an odd, stiff gait. He stood there for maybe 5 minutes, perfectly motionless, facing the dark trees. "Ty, you okay?" Still no response. Concerned now, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The night air was shockingly cold, much colder than it should have been for October in Missouri. My breath came out in visible puffs. "Tyler." He turned toward me, and in the dim glow of the dying fire I saw his face clearly. It was Tyler, same brown hair, same nose, same everything, but his expression was completely blank. His eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "I'm fine," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Going to gather more wood." "At 3 in the morning? Dude, come back to bed. We can get wood in the morning." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. Morning." He walked back to his tent with that same stiff gait and zipped himself inside. I stood there for several more minutes, unsettled by the brief encounter. Something had felt off about the whole interaction, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing Tyler's blank expression in those reflective eyes. Morning brought little relief. I woke to find Tyler already up, cooking breakfast over the camp stove. He seemed normal again, talking and joking as he scrambled eggs and heated coffee, but there were subtle differences I couldn't ignore. He forgot that I took my coffee black, something he'd known for years. When I mentioned our late-night encounter, he claimed no memory of it. "Must have been dreaming," he said with a laugh that sounded just slightly off. Though that would explain why I feel like I didn't sleep at all. That was the other thing. Tyler looked exhausted. His skin was pale, almost gray, with dark circles under his eyes. When I asked if he felt okay, he insisted he was fine. We broke camp and continued deeper into the wilderness, following a trail that led up toward Bell Mountain summit. The path was steeper than yesterday, winding through increasingly dense forest. The silence persisted, that unnatural absence of wildlife that made every footstep sound unnaturally loud. Around noon, Tyler stopped abruptly. "Where are we?" he asked, pulling out his map. I looked around. We were in a narrow valley between two steep ridges, surrounded by dense undergrowth. According to the trail markers, we should be about 2 miles from the summit. Tyler frowned at the map, turning it this way and that. "This doesn't look right. None of these landmarks match what I'm seeing." I took the map from him. He was right. According to our position, we should have been able to see a distinctive rock formation that was clearly marked. Instead, we were surrounded by uniform forest that looked exactly like the forest we'd been walking through for hours. "Maybe we missed a turn," I suggested. We backtracked for half an hour, looking for trail markers we might have missed. When we reached a creek crossing I didn't remember from our hike up, we stopped. "This is impossible," Tyler said, his voice strained. "We've been following the same trail all morning." I checked my compass, then checked it again. According to the needle, we were heading southwest. According to the map and our intended route, we should have been heading northeast. "Must be iron deposits in the rocks," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Messing with the compass." Tyler nodded, but I could see the fear starting to creep into his expression. We'd both heard stories about hikers getting lost in the Ozarks and never being found. We decided to continue forward, hoping to find a recognizable landmark. But as the afternoon wore on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming an almost solid canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The temperature dropped noticeably, and our breath began to fog despite the mild October weather. That's when we started hearing the sounds. At first, it was just a distant rustling, like something large moving through the underbrush. Every time we stopped to listen, the sounds stopped too. But as we continued hiking, they grew closer and more frequent. "Could be deer," Tyler suggested, but his voice was tight with anxiety. "Deer don't sound like that," I replied. The rustling was too deliberate, too purposeful. It sounded like something following us, staying just out of sight. By late afternoon, we were clearly lost. The terrain had become increasingly unfamiliar, with steep ravines and rocky outcroppings that didn't match anything on our map. The rustling sounds had evolved into something worse, the occasional snap of a breaking branch, always from just behind us, always stopping when we turned to look. "We need to find a place to camp," Tyler said. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by barely controlled panic. "We can get our bearings in the morning." We found a small clearing as the sun was setting, barely large enough for our 2 tents. The space felt wrong, too cramped and enclosed, with the surrounding trees pressing in like walls. But it was the only open ground we'd seen in hours. As we set up camp, I noticed Tyler's hands were shaking. When I asked if he was cold, he claimed he was fine, but I could see him fighting to control the tremors. "Mike," he said quietly as we ate dinner, "do you think we're really lost?" "We'll figure it out tomorrow," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Worst case, we can follow the creek downstream. It has to lead somewhere." Tyler nodded, but he kept glancing at the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The silence had returned with a vengeance. Not even the sound of our own breathing seemed to carry beyond the immediate campsite. That night, I woke to the sound of Tyler's tent unzipping again. According to my watch, it was 3:17 a.m., exactly the same time as the night before. I lay still, watching through my tent wall as Tyler's silhouette stood up and walked to the edge of the clearing. This time, I decided to follow. I slipped out of my tent as quietly as possible and crept toward where Tyler stood at the tree line. He was perfectly motionless, facing the dark forest. I got within 10 feet of him before I realized he was talking to something. "Yes, I understand," he was saying in that same flat, emotionless voice from the night before. "Tomorrow." "Tyler?" I whispered. He spun around with inhuman speed, and in the brief moment before clouds covered the moon, I saw his face clearly. It was Tyler's face, but wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. His eyes were too dark, reflecting no light at all. His skin had a grayish pallor, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed too sharp. "You should be sleeping, Mike," he said, his voice carrying an odd harmonic resonance, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. "Who were you talking to?" "No one, just thinking out loud." He moved past me toward his tent, and I caught his scent. Not Tyler's familiar smell of deodorant and hiking sweat, but something else. Something rotten and wild. "Tyler, what's wrong with you?" He stopped and turned back, and his smile widened. "Nothing's wrong, Mike. Everything's exactly as it should be." He crawled into his tent and zipped it shut, leaving me standing alone at the edge of the clearing. I stayed there for several minutes, straining to hear any sound from the forest beyond. Finally, from somewhere far off in the darkness, I heard it. A long, mournful howl that seemed to come from something much larger than any wolf. The howl was answered by another, then another, until the forest around us echoed with an inhuman chorus. I scrambled back to my tent and zipped it tight, pulling my sleeping bag over my head to muffle the sounds. The howling continued until dawn. When I emerged from my tent the next morning, Tyler was already up and making breakfast. He seemed completely normal again, but I noticed he'd lost weight overnight. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and his clothes hung loose on his frame. "Sleep well?" he asked cheerfully. "Did you hear those howls last night?" Tyler frowned. "Howls? No, I didn't hear anything, though I had the weirdest dreams." He paused, spatula halfway to the pan. "I dreamed I was running through the forest, but I was running on all fours. And I was so hungry, Mike. Hungrier than I've ever been in my life." I stared at him, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Just a dream, right?" "Right," Tyler said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Had to be." We packed up quickly and continued hiking, desperate to find our way back to civilization. But the forest seemed determined to keep us. Every path we followed led to dead ends or circled back on itself. The compass spun wildly, pointing in different directions from minute to minute. Most disturbing of all, our supplies were disappearing. I'd carefully inventoried our food before the trip, enough for 4 days. But when I checked my pack that morning, half of it was gone. Not eaten, not scattered, just gone, as if it had never been there. "Mine too," Tyler confirmed when I asked, "but I could have sworn I ate breakfast yesterday, didn't I?" Neither of us could remember clearly. The events of the past few days were becoming increasingly hazy, like trying to recall a half-forgotten dream. By afternoon, we were both stumbling with exhaustion. Tyler's condition had worsened. His skin was now noticeably gray, and he developed a disturbing habit of stopping suddenly to sniff the air, his nostrils flaring like an animal's. "Do you smell that?" he asked as we paused beside another nameless creek. I sniffed but detected nothing unusual. "Smell what?" "Meat," Tyler said, his voice thick with hunger. "Fresh meat." That's when I noticed the bones. They were scattered along the creek bank, white and clean as if they'd been picked completely bare. Most looked like animal bones, deer, maybe, or bear. But mixed among them were others that looked disturbingly human-like. "Tyler," I said slowly, "we need to get out of here. Now." But when I turned around, Tyler was gone. I called his name, panic rising in my throat. The forest swallowed my voice without even an echo. I was completely alone in the silence. I searched for hours, following the creek in both directions, calling until my voice was hoarse. As darkness began to fall, I was forced to face the horrible truth. I was lost in the Missouri wilderness, alone, with no food and no idea which direction led to safety. I made camp beside the creek, building a fire more for psychological comfort than warmth. The bones lay scattered just beyond the firelight, gleaming white in the darkness. That's when Tyler returned. I heard footsteps approaching through the trees and called out in relief. "Tyler! Thank God, I thought—" The thing that stepped into the firelight was wearing Tyler's clothes and Tyler's face, but it wasn't Tyler. It moved wrong, with a predatory grace that no human should possess. Its eyes reflected the firelight with an animal luminescence, and when it smiled, I saw teeth that were definitely not human. "Hello, Mike," it said in Tyler's voice, but underneath the familiar tones was something else, a growling harmonic that made my skin crawl. "You're not Tyler," I whispered. "Of course I am," it replied, settling down across the fire from me. "Who else would I be? Where is he? What did you do with my friend?" The thing that looked like Tyler tilted its head, studying me with predatory interest. "Your friend is right here, Mike. Can't you see him?" It gestured to itself, and for a moment the firelight seemed to flicker. In that instant of shadow, I saw something else entirely. Something tall and skeletal, with yellowed fangs and claws instead of fingernails. Then the light steadied, and it was Tyler again. "I don't understand what's happening," I said, my voice breaking. "You're in the woods, Mike, my woods, and you're lost." It leaned forward, and I caught that rotten smell again, stronger now. "Do you know what a Wendigo is?" The word hit me like a physical blow. Wendigo, the cannibalistic creature from Native American folklore, eternally hungry, eternally hunting. I'd read about them in college, studied the legends for an anthropology class, but they were just stories, weren't they? "They're not real," I said. "Real as hunger, Mike. Real as winter. Real as the choice between dying and becoming something else." It gestured around the clearing. "These mountains have been hungry for a very long time, and sometimes when people get lost up here, really lost, they make that choice. Tyler made that choice." "Tyler's been gone since the first night," the creature said. "What you've been traveling with is just his shape, his memories. I needed time to learn how to be him convincingly." I thought about the strange behavior, the blank expressions, the way Tyler had seemed wrong in subtle ways I couldn't identify. Why? Why not just kill me outright? The Wendigo, wearing Tyler's face, smiled with genuine warmth, an expression that looked obscene on its stolen features. Because fresh meat is so much better when it's been properly tenderized by fear. It began to change as I watched, Tyler's familiar features melting and reshaping themselves. The thing beneath was tall and gaunt, with gray skin stretched tight over prominent bones. Its fingers elongated into claws, and its teeth became rows of yellowed fangs. But the worst part was the eyes. Ancient, intelligent, and absolutely starving. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush in blind terror, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear the Wendigo pursuing, not running, but moving through the forest with horrible efficiency. Occasionally, I heard Tyler's voice calling after me. "Mike, don't run! It'll just make you taste better." I ran for what felt like hours, following no path, just trying to put distance between myself and that thing. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but the terror kept me moving. Every time I thought I'd lost it, I'd hear Tyler's voice from a different direction, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind. Finally, my strength gave out completely. I collapsed beside a fallen log, gasping for breath. The forest around me was completely silent. No sounds of pursuit, no Tyler's voice, nothing. That's when I realized I could see artificial light through the trees. I forced myself to my feet and stumbled toward the glow. After a few dozen yards, I emerged into a parking lot. A parking lot with a familiar sign. Bell Mountain Wilderness Area. I was back at the trailhead where we'd started 3 days ago. My car sat alone in the gravel lot, keys still in my pocket. I fumbled with the door locks, my hands shaking so badly I could barely function. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, desperate to get away from the forest. It wasn't until I was halfway back to St. Louis that I realized what had been nagging at me about the whole experience. According to the timestamp on my car's clock, I'd only been in the woods for 6 hours, but I remembered 3 days. I remembered camping, hiking, getting lost. I remembered Tyler's gradual transformation and my desperate flight through the darkness. The authorities found Tyler's body 2 weeks later, about 5 miles from where we'd made our first camp. According to the coroner, he'd been dead for several days, killed by what appeared to be an animal attack. Large bite marks covered his torso and several pounds of flesh had been consumed. But here's the thing that still haunts me. Tyler was found wearing different clothes than what he'd been wearing when we started the hike, and in his pocket was a note, written in his handwriting but in words he'd never use. The hunger never ends. It just finds new shapes to wear. I never went back to the Mark Twain National Forest. I moved to California, as far from those Missouri woods as I could get. But sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back in that clearing beside Crane Pond. And sometimes, I hear Tyler's voice calling from the darkness. "Mike, come back. I'm still hungry." The doctors say it's trauma-induced hallucinations. The therapists say it's survivor's guilt. But I know the truth. The Wendigo is still out there, still wearing Tyler's face, still hunting in those endless Missouri woods. And sometimes when I catch my own reflection in dark windows, I wonder if it's wearing mine too. Because lately, I've been so very, very hungry. My name is Brian Wright, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Bell Mountain in the Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my 3 closest friends. I should have known something was wrong when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of an hour, even though the weather forecast had promised clear skies and mild October weather. But I was too caught up in the excitement of getting away from the suffocating routine of my data entry job in St. Louis, too eager to breathe clean air and feel dirt under my boots instead of carpet under my desk chair. The 4 of us had been planning this trip for months. There was Marcus Chen, my roommate since college, who worked as a software developer and hadn't seen sunlight that wasn't filtered through office windows in what felt like years. His pale complexion and slight frame made him look younger than his 29 years, but his dry humor and unwavering loyalty had gotten us through countless late-night gaming sessions and relationship disasters. Then there was Jake Sullivan, the self-appointed leader of our group, a construction foreman with arms like tree trunks and a beard that made him look like he'd stepped out of a lumber camp. At 31, he was the oldest among us and never let us forget it, constantly offering unsolicited advice about everything from proper tent setup to which trail mix provided the most protein. His girlfriend, Sarah, had finally agreed to move in with him, and he was practically bouncing off the walls with nervous energy about taking that next step. Finally, there was Tommy Rodriguez, 26, a high school math teacher who spent his summers leading wilderness camps for kids. If anyone should have noticed the signs, it was Tommy. He knew these forests better than the rest of us combined, had hiked every major trail in the Ozarks at least twice. But even he seemed distracted that Friday afternoon as we loaded our gear into Jake's pickup truck, muttering about strange reports from other hikers in the area. Stories about disoriented wildlife and an unusual number of missing persons cases that the local authorities were keeping quiet. "Probably just bears coming out of hibernation early," Jake had said, slapping Tommy on the back with enough force to make him stumble. "Nothing we can't handle." The drive from St. Louis took us through increasingly desolate countryside, past abandoned farmhouses and rusted grain silos that stood like skeletal fingers against the gray October sky. We turned off Highway 72 near Eminence and followed a series of progressively narrower dirt roads that wound deeper into the Mark Twain National Forest. The trees seemed to press closer with each mile, their branches forming a canopy so thick that it blocked out most of the afternoon sun. Bell Mountain wasn't technically a mountain at all, more of a large hill that rose about 1,400 feet above sea level, but it offered some of the most isolated camping in southern Missouri. Tommy had discovered the area during one of his solo hiking trips the previous spring and had been raving about it ever since. Crystal clear streams, abundant wildlife, and best of all, hardly any other people. "It's like stepping back in time," he'd told us. "No cell towers, no power lines, nothing but pure wilderness for miles in every direction." That should have been our first warning. We parked at the end of a logging road that had been abandoned for at least a decade, based on the size of the saplings growing through the cracked asphalt. Our plan was to hike about 3 miles to a secluded valley that Tommy had marked on his topographical map, set up camp near a stream, and spend the weekend doing absolutely nothing except fishing, drinking beer, and pretending we didn't have jobs to return to on Monday. The hike started normally enough. The trail was well marked for the first mile, winding through stands of oak and hickory that were just beginning to turn their autumn colors. Marcus complained about his pack being too heavy, despite the rest of us offering to carry some of his gear. Jake pontificated about the proper way to distribute weight in a backpack, using terms like load-bearing and center of gravity that he'd probably learned from YouTube videos. But as we climbed higher, following Tommy's lead off the main trail and onto what he claimed was a game path, the forest began to feel different. The normal sounds, birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant chatter of squirrels, gradually faded until we were walking in an oppressive silence broken only by our own footsteps and labored breathing. "Is it just me, or does it feel like we're being watched?" Marcus asked during a water break, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "It's just the trees," Jake replied, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Dense forest makes everyone feel claustrophobic at first." Tommy was studying his compass with a deep frown. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "We should have reached the stream by now." "How far off course could we be?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. "That's just it. According to this, we're heading in the right direction. But I've been counting our steps, and we should have covered at least 2.5 miles by now." Jake grabbed the compass and examined it himself. The needle was spinning slowly, never quite settling on magnetic north. "Piece of junk," he declared, though his knuckles were white where he gripped the device. "Probably got magnetized by something in your pack." We pressed on, following what we hoped was still Tommy's game trail, though it seemed to be getting fainter with each step. The trees grew larger and more gnarled, their branches twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, like arthritic fingers reaching toward us. The undergrowth became thicker, forcing us to push through tangles of thorny vines that left thin scratches on our arms and caught at our clothing. It was Marcus who first noticed that we were walking in circles. "Haven't we seen that rock formation before?" he asked, pointing to a cluster of limestone boulders that did look distinctly familiar. Tommy stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale. "We couldn't have. I've been blazing trees with my knife the whole time." He pointed to a nearby oak where he'd carved a small X in the bark. Except now, there were 3 X's, one above the other, in what appeared to be his own handwriting. "When did you make the other 2? Jake demanded. "I didn't," Tommy whispered. "I swear to God, I only marked that tree once." The temperature continued to drop as the afternoon wore on, though according to Marcus's watch it should have been getting warmer as we descended into the valley. Our breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the edges of leaves despite the fact that it was still early October. "Microclimates," Jake said, but his voice had taken on a hollow quality. "Valleys can trap cold air." None of us mentioned that we hadn't actually found any valley yet, despite hiking for what felt like hours. By the time we finally admitted we were completely lost, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of the swaying branches overhead. We were exhausted, dehydrated, and starting to panic, though none of us wanted to be the first to admit it. "We need to stop and set up camp," Tommy announced, his authority as our wilderness guide firmly reasserted. "It's not safe to keep hiking in the dark, especially when we don't know where we are." we found a small clearing surrounded by towering pines that creaked ominously in the wind. The ground was soft with decades of accumulated pine needles, but when Jake tried to drive in the first tent stake, it hit something hard just a few inches down. "Probably just rocks," he grunted, moving to a different spot. But everywhere we tried, the stakes wouldn't go more than a few inches into the earth before hitting the same inexplicable resistance. "It's like the whole clearing is sitting on top of a concrete slab," Marcus observed, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "We finally managed to get the tents set up by weighing down the corners with rocks instead of using stakes. The process took much longer than it should have, and by the time we finished, true darkness had fallen with the abrupt finality of a curtain dropping. That's when we discovered that our flashlights weren't working properly. All four of us had brought LED flashlights with fresh batteries, but the beams seemed weak and diffuse, barely penetrating more than a few feet into the surrounding darkness. The light had a strange quality to it, almost oily, that made everything it touched look distorted and wrong. "Maybe it's the humidity," Marcus suggested, though there was no humidity. The air was bone dry and getting colder by the minute. We gathered wood for a fire, which should have been easy given the abundance of fallen branches around the clearing. But every piece of wood we collected felt damp and heavy, as if it had been soaking in water for weeks, even though there hadn't been rain in the area for over a month according to the weather reports. Jake used nearly half a can of lighter fluid before he finally got a small flame going, and even then, the fire seemed reluctant to catch. The flames burned with an odd bluish tint and gave off almost no heat, despite the crackling sound of burning wood. "This is seriously weird," Tommy said, crouching next to the fire and holding his hands toward the flames. "I can barely feel any warmth at all." The cold continued to deepen as we sat around our pathetic excuse for a campfire, eating cold sandwiches from our packs and trying to pretend that everything was normal. But conversation was stilted and forced, each of us lost in our own thoughts about the series of small impossibilities that had been piling up since we'd left the main trail. "So what's the plan for tomorrow?" Jake asked, his voice artificially cheerful. "Find the trail," Tommy replied flatly. "Get the hell out of here." "Come on, it's not that bad," Jake protested, though he'd been huddling closer to the fire and jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. "We're just a little turned around. Happens to everyone." "Jake," Marcus said quietly, "look at your phone." We all pulled out our phones and stared at the screens in growing horror. Every single device showed the same impossible time, 11:47 p.m. But that couldn't be right. We'd only been in the clearing for a couple of hours at most. "My watch says 8:30, Marcus whispered, holding up his wrist. But as we watched, the hands began moving backward, spinning counterclockwise until they stopped at 11:47. "What the hell is happening?" Jake's voice cracked like a teenager's. None of us had an answer. We tried to get some sleep, though sleep proved impossible. The temperature had dropped so low that frost was forming on the outside of our sleeping bags, despite the fact that we were all wearing multiple layers and had sleeping bags rated for temperatures well below freezing. But it wasn't just the cold that kept us awake. It was the sounds. They started around midnight. Soft footsteps circling our camp just beyond the weak reach of our dying fire. Footsteps that stopped whenever one of us sat up to listen, then resumed as soon as we tried to lie back down. "Probably just deer," Tommy whispered, but his voice was shaking. The footsteps were too regular for deer, too deliberate. They were the footsteps of something walking upright, something that was deliberately staying just out of sight. Around 2 a.m., Marcus's sleeping bag was found empty. I woke to Jake shaking me violently, his face a mask of terror in the firelight. "Brian, wake up! Marcus is gone!" I sat up, immediately feeling the bite of the frigid air, and looked around the clearing. Marcus's sleeping bag was lying flat and empty about 10 feet from the fire, but here's what made my blood turn to ice. It was unzipped from the inside. "Marcus!" Tommy called into the darkness, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Marcus, where are you?" There was no answer, just the continued sound of footsteps circling us. now accompanied by what sounded almost like breathing, deep, raspy inhalations that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We have to look for him," Jake said, grabbing his flashlight. "No," Tommy said firmly. "We don't split up. That's how people die in situations like this." "So, we just leave him out there?" "We wait for daylight," Tommy replied, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "Whatever's out there, it doesn't want to come into the light of the fire." We spent the rest of the night feeding our pathetic fire with every piece of wood we could find, taking turns staying awake to keep the flames going. The footsteps continued, sometimes close enough that we could hear twigs snapping under the weight of whatever was making them, sometimes fading into the distance before returning with renewed intensity. Just before dawn, Marcus came back. We heard him before we saw him, stumbling through the underbrush at the edge of the clearing, calling our names in a voice that was recognizably his but somehow off in a way I couldn't immediately place. Guys, I'm here. I'm okay." He emerged into the firelight looking disheveled but unharmed. His clothes were covered in pine needles and dirt, and there were scratches on his face and hands, but he was smiling. A wide, bright smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Where the hell have you been?" Jake demanded, relief and anger warring in his voice. "I don't know," Marcus replied, that strange smile never wavering. "I must have been sleepwalking. Woke up about a quarter mile from here next to this really interesting tree formation." "You don't sleepwalk," Tommy said slowly. "Must have been the stress," Marcus said, his voice oddly cheerful. "You know how it is. New environment, being lost, all that stuff. Makes people do strange things." There was something wrong with the way he was talking. Marcus had always been the most anxious member of our group, constantly worrying about everything from test grades to whether he'd remembered to lock his car. This casual, carefree demeanor was completely unlike him. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked. "Never better," he replied, and when he turned to look at me, I noticed that he was blinking far less than normal. His eyes stayed fixed on mine for uncomfortably long periods, never shifting or darting around the way people's eyes naturally do during conversation. As the sun rose, we packed up our camp as quickly as possible, eager to find our way back to civilization and away from whatever had stalked us through the night. But in the growing daylight, the forest looked completely different than it had the day before. The trees were wrong. I don't mean they were different species or arranged differently. I mean they were physically wrong in ways that hurt to look at. Branches grew in impossible angles, some actually weaving through the trunks of other trees in ways that defied basic physics. The bark on many of the oaks had patterns that looked almost like faces, with dark knots forming what appeared to be eyes and mouths frozen in expressions of agony. "Did you guys notice these yesterday?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Tommy replied. "These definitely weren't here yesterday." Marcus seemed oblivious to our growing horror. He walked ahead of us with that same unsettling smile, humming softly under his breath, a tune none of us recognized that seemed to have too many notes, harmonies that shouldn't have been possible for a human voice to produce. "Marcus," I called. "What are you humming?" He stopped and turned back to us, tilting his head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be natural. "Was I humming? I didn't realize. What was the song?" "I don't know," he said. "Just something I heard last night, in the forest." The admission sent ice through my veins. "You heard music in the forest?" "Oh, yes," Marcus replied, his smile widening to show too many teeth. "The most beautiful music. You should hear it sometime." We tried to retrace our steps, following Tommy's marked trees back toward what we hoped was the main trail. But Marcus's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He would stop suddenly to examine things that weren't there, crouching down to study empty patches of ground and nodding as if agreeing with something only he could hear. "The roots go so deep," he said during one of these episodes, running his fingers through ordinary dirt. "Miles and miles down. Did you know they're still growing?" "Marcus, there's nothing there," Jake said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Oh, but there is," Marcus replied, looking up at us with eyes that reflected light like an animal's, even though we were standing in full daylight. "You just have to know how to look." It was Tommy who first suggested that whatever had taken Marcus in the night had brought something else back in his place. We were taking a water break when Marcus wandered off again, claiming he wanted to check something behind a cluster of boulders. As soon as he was out of earshot, Tommy grabbed my arm with fingers that dug in like claws. "That's not Marcus," he whispered urgently. "What do you mean?" "I mean that thing walking around in Marcus's body. It's not him. I've known Marcus for 8 years. He's lactose intolerant, but he ate cheese from Jake's sandwich this morning without any problems. He's afraid of heights, but he was climbing over rocks earlier like it was nothing. And did you see how he reacted when I mentioned his sister Jennifer?" I had noticed. When Tommy had asked Marcus to call Jennifer and let her know we were safe, Marcus had stared blankly for several seconds before asking, "Who's Jennifer?" "So what are you saying?" Jake demanded. "That something killed Marcus and is wearing his skin?" "I'm saying something took Marcus, and what came back isn't human." We all jumped when Marcus reappeared from behind the rocks, still wearing that unnatural smile. "What are you guys talking about?" he asked, and his voice had developed a strange quality, as if there were multiple people speaking in unison. "Nothing," Tommy said quickly. "Just trying to figure out which way to go." "Oh, I know which way to go," Marcus said, pointing deeper into the forest in the opposite direction from where Tommy's marked trees indicated the trail should be. "That way. Definitely that way." "The trail is this way," Tommy said firmly, pointing toward his markings. Marcus's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something dark and hungry that definitely wasn't human. "No," he said, and his voice dropped to a register that was too low for his slight frame. "That way is wrong. Very wrong." We followed Tommy's trail markers despite Marcus's increasingly agitated protests. With each step, the thing wearing Marcus's face became more obviously not human. It walked wrong, taking too long strides and never seeming to tire. It breathed wrong, with irregular patterns that sometimes stopped altogether for minutes at a time. And it smelled wrong. A sweet, rotting odor like fruit left too long in the sun. By mid-afternoon, we finally found the main trail, marked with official Forest Service signs that looked beautifully normal after the twisted wrongness of the deep woods. But our relief was short-lived. Marcus, or the thing that looked like Marcus, refused to leave the forest. "You go ahead," it said, backing away from the trail markers. "I think I'll stay here a while longer. This place is starting to grow on me." "Marcus, come on," Jake pleaded. "Sarah's expecting me back tonight. Your boss will fire you if you don't show up tomorrow." "Sarah," the Marcus thing repeated, tilting its head. "Boss? I don't understand these words." That's when Tommy pulled out his hunting knife. "Get away from it," he told Jake and me, his voice deadly serious. "That's not Marcus. I don't know what it is, but it's not human, and it's not leaving these woods with us." The thing that looked like Marcus laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with the screech of rusted metal. As it laughed, its face began to change. The features remained recognizably Marcus's, but they shifted and flowed like melting wax. Its smile stretched wider than any human mouth should be able to open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "You finally figured it out," it said, and now its voice was a horrible parody of Marcus's normal tone. "Though it took you long enough, I was starting to think I'd have to spell it out for you." "What did you do with our friend?" Tommy demanded, gripping his knife so tightly his knuckles were white. "Oh, he's still here," the creature replied, patting its chest. "Deep down inside. Would you like to talk to him?" Before any of us could respond, the thing's expression shifted, becoming a perfect imitation of Marcus's normal, anxious demeanor. When it spoke again, it was in Marcus's exact voice, filled with terror and pain. "Guys, help me," it said, tears streaming down its face. "It's in my head. It's eating my memories. I can feel myself disappearing. Please, you have to." The expression shifted back to that horrible smile, cutting off Marcus's plea mid-sentence. "He says hello," the creature continued in its own voice. "He also says goodbye. He won't be needing this body much longer." Tommy lunged forward with his knife, but the creature moved with inhuman speed, dodging the blade and grabbing Tommy's wrist. There was a wet, snapping sound, and Tommy screamed as his arm bent at an impossible angle. "Tommy!" Jake and I rushed forward, but the creature was already moving, dragging the injured Tommy toward the dark line of trees. "Run!" Tommy gasped as the thing's grip tightened around his broken arm. "Run, and don't look back. Don't let it follow you home." That was the last thing Tommy said before the creature's other hand clamped over his mouth. They disappeared into the underbrush, leaving Jake and me alone on the trail with the sound of Tommy's muffled screams fading into the distance. We ran. We ran like the hounds of hell were chasing us, which might not have been far from the truth. Behind us, deeper in the forest, we could hear sounds that no earthly creature should have been able to make. Howls that started in registers too low for human ears and climbed to frequencies that made our teeth ache. Jake had always been the strongest among us, but I was the distance runner, and as we pounded down the trail toward the parking area, I gradually pulled ahead. Every few hundred yards, I would stop and wait for him to catch up, but each time the gap between us grew larger. "Go," he gasped during one of these stops, his face red and his breathing labored. "Don't wait for me. Get to the truck and call for help." "I'm not leaving you behind," I said, though the sounds behind us were getting closer. "One of us has to make it out," he insisted. "Sarah needs to know what happened. Tommy's family needs to know." I wanted to argue, but the rational part of my brain knew he was right. Whatever was hunting us moved faster than either of us could run, and our only chance was for one of us to reach civilization and bring back help. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, my lungs burning and my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, though I knew it was only about 3 miles from where we'd camped to the parking area. Every shadow looked like it might contain something horrible. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. I found Jake's truck exactly where we'd left it, looking absurdly normal and civilized after everything we'd experienced. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition, but finally the engine roared to life and I was speeding down the dirt road toward the highway. I made it about 2 miles before I saw Jake in the headlights. He was standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, with that same unnatural smile that the Marcus thing had worn. His clothes were torn and bloody, and there were scratches covering his face and arms, but he was smiling, that horrible, too wide smile. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just a few feet from where he stood. For a moment, we stared at each other through the windshield. Then Jake tilted his head at that impossible angle and mouthed a single word: "Run." But his mouth wasn't moving in sync with the word. It was like watching a badly dubbed movie where the audio doesn't match the video. And in that instant, I realized that Jake, the real Jake, was trying to warn me about the creature that had taken his body. I floored the accelerator and drove straight at him. The thing wearing Jake's face leaped aside with inhuman agility, landing in the underbrush beside the road. In my rearview mirror, I saw it stand up and begin chasing the truck, moving faster than any human could run, its limbs bending in ways that made my stomach lurch. But the truck was faster, and within minutes, I'd left it far behind. I drove straight to the Johnson County Sheriff's Department and told them everything. They listened with the kind of polite skepticism reserved for drunk drivers and UFO witnesses. But when I showed them the GPS coordinates for where we'd camped, something in the duty officer's expression changed. "You boys weren't supposed to be in that area," he said quietly. "That whole section of the forest has been off limits since last spring." "Off limits? Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out a file from his desk drawer. "We've had 17 missing persons cases in that area over the past 6 months," he said. "Hikers, campers, hunters, all experienced outdoorsmen, all disappeared without a trace." "What about the families? Haven't they been asking questions?" The officer's expression grew even grimmer. That's the strange part. In most cases, the missing persons came back. At least, people who looked like them came back. But the families started calling us within days, saying their loved ones were acting strange. Wrong, somehow. I felt ice forming in my stomach. What kind of wrong? Different personalities, forgotten memories, physical abilities they never had before, and in every case, within a week or two, the families themselves would disappear. He pulled out a photograph and slid it across the desk. It showed a family of 4, parents and 2 children, standing in front of what looked like a normal suburban home, but their smiles were all wrong, too wide and somehow hungry. The Hendersons, the officer said, missing for 3 weeks now, but their neighbors swear they saw them just last Tuesday, working in their garden. Said they waved, but something about it felt wrong. I stared at the photograph, remembering the thing that had worn Marcus's face, and a horrible realization began to dawn on me. "How many of these things are there?" I whispered. "We don't know," the officer replied, "but they're spreading. Whatever's in those woods, it's not staying there anymore." That was 3 weeks ago. The search and rescue teams found no trace of Marcus, Tommy, or Jake, though they did find our campsite. According to their report, the clearing where we'd spent that terrible night was perfectly normal. Soft earth that took tent stakes easily, plenty of dry firewood, and no signs of the wrongness that had surrounded us. They also found tracks. Lots of tracks. Human footprints leading in all directions away from the campsite, disappearing into the forest like a spiderweb of wandering paths. I've been staying in a motel outside of Springfield since then, afraid to go home, afraid to contact anyone I know, because I keep thinking about what the officer said about the families disappearing, and I keep remembering the way that thing smiled with Marcus's face. 3 days ago, I got a call on my cell phone. The caller ID said it was Marcus. "Hey, Brian," said a voice that was perfectly exactly Marcus's voice. "Where are you? We've been looking for you. Jake wants to know if you're coming to his wedding. Sarah's so excited." I hung up without saying anything, but the phone rang again immediately. "Don't be rude," said Jake's voice. "We just want to see you. We miss you." I turned off the phone and threw it in a dumpster behind the motel. But that night, I heard them outside my window. Marcus, Jake, and Tommy, all talking in their normal voices, all sounding perfectly human except for the slight echo that suggested they were speaking in unison. "Brian," they called. "Brian, we know you're in there. We just want to talk. We have so much to tell you about our new home." I didn't answer, didn't even breathe, and eventually they went away. But I know they'll be back, and I know that sooner or later they'll find a way in. Because the thing about Wendigos, and that's what I think we encountered in those woods, some ancient hunger given form and malice, is that they're never satisfied with just one victim. They spread like a plague, taking over more and more people, wearing their faces and speaking with their voices until you can't tell who's real and who's been replaced. And now they're looking for me. I'm writing this down because I need people to know what happened. I need someone to understand that if you see me in the coming days or weeks, if I show up at your door with a smile and a story about how I made it out safely, don't trust me. Look closely at my eyes. Listen carefully to my voice. Ask me questions that only the real Brian Wright would know the answers to, because I don't think I'm going to make it much longer. They're getting closer every night, and I'm running out of places to hide. And the worst part is, sometimes I find myself wanting to open the door when they call. Sometimes their voices sound so much like my friends that I almost believe they really did make it out of those woods alive. Almost. But then I remember Marcus's terrified voice pleading for help from inside his own stolen body, and I know that whatever's wearing their faces now, it isn't them. It's something older and hungrier and infinitely more patient than anything human should ever have to face. If you're reading this, please stay away from Bell Mountain. Stay away from the Mark Twain National Forest. And if anyone you know goes hiking in that area and comes back acting strange, don't try to help them. Run. Run as far and as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because the forest is hungry, and it's always looking for more faces to wear. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Bell Mountain Wilderness of Missouri, deep in the Mark Twain National Forest, where the ancient Ozark peaks rise like broken teeth against an indifferent sky. I should have known something was wrong when Jake insisted we camp at Devil's Backbone Ridge. My best friend since college had always been the cautious type, the guy who packed 3 flashlights and enough MREs to survive a nuclear winter. But when he suggested we trek into one of the most isolated corners of the forest, something in his eyes looked different, hungry. "Come on, Mike," he'd said, spreading the topographical map across my kitchen table 3 weeks earlier. His finger traced the contours of Bell Mountain, lingering on the blank spaces between the marked trails. When's the last time we really got away from everything? No cell towers, no hiking trails packed with Instagram hikers, just us and the wilderness. I'd agreed because Jake was going through a rough patch. His girlfriend Emma had left him 6 months ago, and his job at the engineering firm was slowly crushing his soul. He needed this trip, and I needed a break from my own problems, namely the crushing anxiety that had been following me like a shadow since my father's sudden death the previous winter. We drove out on a Friday morning in early October when the Missouri forests were painted in shades of amber and rust. The last town we passed through was Centerville, population 800, where the gas station attendant looked at our heavy packs and shook his head. "Y'all headed up to Bell Mountain?" he asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "That's the plan," Jake replied, paying for our supplies. The old man leaned across the counter. "Been a lot of strange reports coming out of there lately. Hikers going missing, finding camps torn apart like something went through them with claws. State Park Service ain't saying much, but the locals know better than to go up there after dark." Jake laughed it off. "Old mountain folklore. Every wilderness area has its stories." But I noticed his hand trembling slightly as he pocketed the change. We parked at the Bell Mountain trailhead just after noon. The October sun felt weak through the canopy, and an unseasonable chill had settled into the air. Jake seemed energized, almost manic, as we shouldered our packs and started up the narrow deer trail that would take us deep into the wilderness. "This is going to be perfect," he said, his breathing already labored from the climb. "Just like the old days in college, remember? When we hiked the Appalachian Trail that summer?" I remembered. I also remembered how we'd both been 20 pounds lighter and infinitely more optimistic about our place in the world. Now, at 28, I could feel every year in my knees as we climbed the rocky switchbacks that led toward the ridge. The trail grew increasingly faint as we ascended. Jake had insisted we take an unmarked path he'd found on some obscure hiking forum, a secret route that would take us to a secluded camping spot near the summit. By late afternoon, I was beginning to doubt the wisdom of following unmarked trails deep into the Missouri wilderness. "You sure about this route?" I called ahead to Jake, who was setting a punishing pace despite his earlier breathlessness. He turned back, and for just a moment his face looked strange in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. His smile was too wide, his eyes too bright. "Trust me, Mike. I know exactly where we're going." Something cold crawled up my spine, but I attributed it to the dropping temperature and my own exhaustion. We'd been climbing for 6 hours straight. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in long, angular shadows, we finally reached Jake's chosen campsite. It was a small clearing near the edge of Devil's Backbone Ridge, offering a spectacular view of the Current River Valley far below. Under normal circumstances, it would have been breathtaking. Instead, it felt exposed and wrong. The clearing was too perfect, too circular, as if something had deliberately cleared the trees in a precise pattern. The ground was covered in a thin layer of yellowed grass that crunched underfoot like old bones. At the center of the clearing stood a single dead oak, its bare branches reaching toward the darkening sky like gnarled fingers. "Isn't this incredible?" Jake said, dropping his pack near the dead tree. "We're probably the first people to camp here in decades." I wasn't so sure about that. As I set up my tent on the opposite side of the clearing, I noticed strange markings carved into the bark of several trees around the perimeter, symbols that looked almost like writing, but in no language I recognized. They were old, weathered by years of exposure, but something about them made my skin crawl. "Jake, look at this," I called, pointing to the nearest carved tree. But when I turned around, he was gone. "Jake?" I called into the gathering darkness. No response. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, my flashlight beam dancing across the strange symbols. The forest beyond the clearing was absolutely silent. No insects, no wind, no night sounds at all. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. 10 minutes later, Jake emerged from the tree line carrying an armload of firewood. "Where the hell did you go?" I demanded, relief and irritation fighting for control in my voice. He looked confused. "Getting wood for the fire. I told you I was going." "No, you didn't." Jake shrugged, but something in his expression looked off. "Must have forgot." "Sorry, man. Let's get this fire going before it gets too cold." We built the fire near the center of the clearing, close to the dead oak. As the flames grew higher, I noticed Jake staring into them with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The firelight played across his face, casting deep shadows that made his features look alien. "You feeling okay?" I asked as we ate our dehydrated camping meals. "Never better," he replied, but his voice sounded strange, flatter somehow, as if he was speaking from very far away. "This place, it feels like home." I laughed nervously. "Home? We're in the middle of nowhere." Jake turned to look at me, and in the flickering firelight his eyes looked wrong. Too dark, too deep, as if they were windows into something vast and hungry. "Nowhere," he repeated slowly as if tasting the word. "Yes, exactly." That night I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the absolute silence of the forest. No owls, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of nocturnal animals. Even the wind had died completely, leaving only the soft crackling of our dying fire. Around midnight I heard Jake's tent zipper. Through the thin nylon of my own tent I could see his silhouette moving around the clearing. He seemed to be examining the carved symbols on the trees, running his fingers over them as if reading Braille. "Jake," I whispered, "everything okay?" He didn't respond. After a few minutes, I heard his tent zipper again, and then silence. I didn't sleep well. My dreams were filled with images of endless forests and something vast and hungry moving through the trees. In my dreams, I could hear my father's voice calling my name, but when I tried to find him, all I found were empty trails that led deeper into darkness. I woke before dawn to find Jake already up, sitting cross-legged beside the cold ashes of our fire. He was facing away from me, staring out over the ridge toward the valley below. "Morning," I called, unzipping my tent. He didn't respond immediately. When he finally turned to look at me, his face was pale and drawn, as if he hadn't slept at all. "Did you hear it?" he asked. "Hear what?" "The calling, from down in the valley. Something's been calling all night." I had heard nothing except the oppressive silence, but I didn't want to contradict him. Jake looked like he was barely holding himself together. "Maybe it was just the wind," I suggested. Jake shook his head slowly. "There's no wind up here. Haven't you noticed? The air doesn't move. It's like we're trapped under glass." He was right. The air was perfectly still, unnaturally so. Even on the calmest days there should have been some movement, some stirring of leaves, but the forest around us was frozen in absolute stillness. "We should probably head back today," I said carefully. "Maybe find a different campsite lower down." Jake's expression hardened. "No, we're staying. This is where we need to be." "Need to be? What are you talking about?" "You wouldn't understand," he said, turning back toward the valley. "You never understood the hunger." The word hung in the air between us like a curse. Hunger. Something about the way he said it made my stomach clench with fear. We spent the morning in tense silence. Jake seemed to be listening for something, his head cocked at odd angles, his eyes scanning the tree line constantly. I tried to engage him in conversation, but his responses were monosyllabic and distracted. Around noon, he announced that he was going to gather more firewood. "I'll come with you," I offered, not wanting to be alone in the clearing. "No," he said sharply. "I need to go alone. It's important." "Jake, what's going on? You're acting really strange." He looked at me with those two dark eyes, and for a moment I could swear I saw something else looking back, something that wasn't my friend at all. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice had that flat, distant quality again. "Just changing." He disappeared into the trees, leaving me alone in the clearing with the carved symbols and the dead oak and the suffocating silence. This time, he was gone for 3 hours. When he finally returned, I almost didn't recognize him. Jake had always been thin, but now he looked gaunt, his cheeks hollow and his eyes sunken deep in their sockets. His clothes hung loose on his frame as if he'd lost 20 pounds overnight. "Jesus, Jake, what happened to you?" He smiled, and I saw that his teeth looked wrong, too sharp, too long. "I found what I was looking for." "What are you talking about?" "The source of the calling. It's been waiting for so long, Mike, waiting for someone to understand." I stood up, backing away from him instinctively. "You're scaring me, man. We need to get you to a doctor." Jake laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Doctor? No, Mike. What I have, medicine can't cure. What I have is older than medicine, older than civilization." That's when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, a sweet, sick odor that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. But as Jake moved closer, it grew stronger, the unmistakable stench of decay. "You smell that?" I whispered. "I smell everything," Jake replied. "I smell your fear. I smell your sweat. I smell the life flowing through your veins." He took another step toward me, and I could see that his skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Dark veins were visible beneath the surface, spreading up his neck like infection. "Jake, please, let me help you." "You are helping me," he said. "You're going to help me more than you know." I ran. I grabbed my pack and sprinted for the tree line, crashing through the underbrush as Jake's laughter echoed behind me. I had no plan except to get away from whatever my friend had become. But the forest had other ideas. Every trail I followed seemed to curve back on itself. Every landmark I passed appeared again and again, as if I were running in circles. The daylight was fading fast, and I was no closer to finding my way out than when I'd started. Worse, I could hear Jake following me. Not running, walking with slow, deliberate steps that somehow kept pace with my frantic sprint. And he was talking, his voice carrying through the trees with unnatural clarity. "You can't leave, Mike," he called. "This place won't let you. It needs you to stay. We need you to stay." We. I didn't want to think about what that meant. As darkness fell, I realized I was completely lost. My phone had no signal, hadn't had any since we'd left the trailhead, and my GPS unit was showing nothing but static. The topographical map in my pack might as well have been blank paper for all the good it did me. I found a dense thicket of brambles and crawled inside, hoping to hide until morning. My hands were bleeding from the thorns, but I barely felt the pain. Fear had numbed everything except the frantic beating of my heart. "Mike," Jake's voice drifted through the darkness much closer than I'd expected. "Why are you hiding from me? We've been friends for so long. Don't you trust me?" I held my breath, pressing myself deeper into the brambles. "I know you're scared," he continued, and I could hear the rustling of leaves as he moved through the forest. "Change is always frightening, but you don't understand what I've been offered, what we've been offered." His voice was different now, layered, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. Some of the voices sounded familiar, but I couldn't place them through my terror. "There's so much hunger in the world, Mike, so much emptiness. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can fill the emptiness. We can feed the hunger." I pressed my hands over my mouth to stifle a sob. "Your father understood at the end," Jake's voice said, and my blood turned to ice. Just before he died, he felt it calling to him, the hunger that lives in all of us. He fought it, but he understood. How could Jake know about my father's final moments? I had been there, holding his hand in the hospital room, watching him struggle against something invisible in his last minutes of life. He had been trying to tell me something, his eyes wide with terror, but the words had come out as meaningless whispers. "He tried to warn you," the voices continued, "but you weren't ready to listen. Now you are." Light appeared through the trees, not the warm glow of a flashlight, but something cold and blue that seemed to emanate from Jake himself. I could see his silhouette moving between the trees, but his proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung nearly to the ground. "Come out, Mike. Let me show you what I've learned." I waited until the light had moved past my hiding spot, then crept out of the brambles and ran in the opposite direction. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I kept running through the absolute darkness of the Missouri forest. I don't know how long I ran before I saw it, a faint glow ahead that I hoped might be another camper's fire. I stumbled toward it, gasping for breath, and found myself back in our clearing. The campsite looked different. The dead oak in the center was larger, its branches spreading wider, and the carved symbols on the surrounding trees were glowing with the same cold blue light I'd seen emanating from Jake. Our tents were gone, replaced by strange structures made of woven branches and what looked like strips of dried meat. Jake was waiting for me beside the oak, but he was no longer recognizably human. His limbs had stretched impossibly long, his fingers ending in sharp claws that dripped with dark fluid. His face had elongated into something lupine, with a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. But the worst part was his eyes. They were still Jake's eyes, trapped in that monstrous form, pleading with me to understand. "Now you see," he said, his voice a harmony of human speech and animal growling. "This is what we're meant to become, what we've always been meant to become." Behind him, other figures emerged from the shadows around the clearing. They had once been human, I realized, but had undergone the same terrible transformation. Men and women and even children, all stretched and twisted into these impossible predatory forms. "The hunger called to us," Jake explained, taking a step toward me. "It's been calling for centuries, waiting for someone strong enough to answer." I answered, "Mike, and now it's your turn." "No," I whispered, backing toward the edge of the clearing. "Your father tried to resist," one of the other creatures said in a voice I recognized as my father's, though it came from a throat that was no longer human. But the hunger was stronger. It's always stronger. I saw him then, among the twisted figures. My father, transformed into the same monstrous shape as the others. The man who had raised me, taught me to fish and hunt and love the wilderness, had become something that fed on human flesh. "We've been waiting for you," he said with that voice I'd missed so desperately. "Waiting for you to join us." The creatures began to circle me, moving with predatory grace. I could smell the decay that clung to them, could see the remnants of their last meals stuck between their teeth. "The transformation doesn't hurt," Jake assured me, his claws extending toward my throat. "It's like coming home." I pulled my knife from my belt, a pathetic gesture against these monsters, but the only weapon I had. The blade caught the blue light from the symbols, casting strange shadows across the clearing. "Fight it, Jake," I pleaded. "You're still in there. I can see you." For just a moment, something human flickered in his eyes. "Mike," he whispered, and his voice was his own again. "Run." The other creatures turned on him with savage fury, their claws tearing into his stretched flesh. Jake screamed, a sound that was part human agony and part animal howl, and I used the distraction to sprint for the tree line once again. This time, I didn't try to follow any trails. I crashed through the undergrowth in what I hoped was a straight line away from the clearing, using my knife to hack through the dense vegetation. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I kept moving. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of the creatures finishing what they had started with Jake. His screams died away, replaced by wet, tearing sounds that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. I ran through the night, guided only by the faint starlight filtering through the canopy. My water ran out around midnight, my energy reserves shortly after, but terror kept me moving long past the point where my body should have collapsed. Just before dawn, I stumbled out of the tree line and found myself on a paved road. A Missouri state trooper found me there an hour later, delirious and babbling about monsters in the forest. The official report listed Jake as missing, presumed dead due to animal attack. They found our original campsite, but not the clearing where I'd last seen him. The search teams found no trace of the carved symbols, no evidence of the creatures I'd described, but they did find bones. Lots of bones, scattered throughout the Bell Mountain wilderness. Human bones that had been cracked open and gnawed clean. I spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility, where well-meaning doctors tried to convince me that I'd suffered a psychological break brought on by grief and isolation. They explained that my father's death had left me vulnerable to hallucinations, that the stress of being lost in the wilderness had caused me to project my fears onto my friend. I let them believe that. It was easier than trying to convince them of the truth. But I know what I saw in that clearing. I know what Jake became, what my father became, and I know that they're still out there, in the deep places of the Missouri wilderness, waiting for the next hiker who strays too far from the marked trails. The hunger is patient. It has been calling for centuries, and it will continue calling until there are enough of them to answer. Until the wilderness is full of twisted shapes that were once human, feeding on anyone foolish enough to venture into their domain. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear Jake's voice calling my name. Not the monstrous voice he spoke with at the end, but his real voice. The voice of my friend who went into the forest and never came back. He's still out there, somewhere in the darkness beyond Bell Mountain. Still hungry, still waiting. And sometimes, God help me, I'm tempted to go back and join him. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Irish wilderness of Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri, 3 months ago. I'm writing this down because the therapist says it might help, but mostly because I need someone to know what really happened to David. What happened to my best friend out there in those ancient woods where the trees whisper secrets that should never be heard? David Jones and I had been friends since college, bonded by our shared love of the outdoors and our mutual inability to sit still in cubicles for too long. We'd been planning this backpacking trip for months, a long weekend in one of Missouri's most remote wilderness areas, far from cell towers and civilization. The Irish wilderness seemed perfect. 19,000 acres of mixed oak, hickory, and shortleaf pine, with only a few scattered trails and plenty of opportunity to get completely lost in nature. We should have stayed lost in a different way. The drive down from St. Louis took us through increasingly rural Missouri countryside until we reached the final dirt road leading to the trailhead. David was in high spirits, singing along badly to classic rock on the radio, tapping the steering wheel of his Jeep with infectious enthusiasm. He'd been looking forward to this trip more than usual. Work had been grinding him down, and his recent breakup with Sarah had left him restless and irritable. "I need to reset my brain," he'd told me while we loaded our gear that morning. "Get back to basics, you know? Just me, you, and the wild." The wild. If I'd known then what that word really meant in the Irish wilderness, I would have turned us around immediately. We parked at the small gravel lot near the Whites Creek Trail access around 3 in the afternoon. October in Missouri can be unpredictable, but the weather forecast had promised us crisp days and cool nights, perfect hiking weather. The trees were just beginning their autumn transformation, splashes of gold and crimson against the deep green of the remaining summer foliage. A light breeze carried the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the distant promise of winter. "God, smell that air," David said, shouldering his pack with practiced ease. He was the more experienced hiker between us, with better gear and an almost obsessive attention to trail details. "When's the last time you smelled air that wasn't full of exhaust fumes and disappointment?" I laughed, adjusting my own pack straps. "Last month, when we hiked the Devil's Backbone," but even as I said it, I realized this place felt different. The air here carried something else beneath the familiar forest scents, something older and hungrier. I attributed it to nerves and excitement. We began our hike on the established trail, planning to follow it for several miles before branching off to find a good spot to set up our base camp. The Irish wilderness is unique in Missouri for its relative lack of official trails. Most of the area is true backcountry, navigated by compass and instinct rather than marked paths. David had studied topographical maps for weeks, identifying a small clearing near a seasonal creek where we could pitch our tents and use as a launching point for day hikes deeper into the wilderness. The first few hours of hiking were perfect. The trail wound through mature hardwood forest, crossing small streams on crude log bridges and skirting around moss-covered boulders that spoke to the ancient geological history of the Ozarks. We saw deer sign, turkey tracks, and the scratched bark that suggested black bears had passed through recently. Normal wilderness markers that should have felt comforting. David kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out plants he recognized and sharing stories from his recent solo camping trips. He'd been doing more solo excursions lately, claiming he needed the solitude to think. But I noticed he seemed jumpier than usual, pausing frequently to listen to sounds I couldn't identify and checking his GPS unit more often than necessary. "You okay, man?" I asked during one of our rest stops about 5 miles in. "You seem a little on edge." He took a long drink from his water bottle before answering. I don't know. Something feels off today. Probably just work stress." But his eyes kept scanning the tree line as he spoke, and I noticed his hand unconsciously checking that his knife was still clipped to his belt. We left the established trail around 5:30, following David's compass bearing toward our planned campsite. This was when the Irish wilderness began to reveal its true character. Away from the maintained path, the forest grew denser and more primitive. Ancient oak trees stretched their gnarled branches overhead like arthritic fingers, creating a canopy so thick that the afternoon light filtering through took on an eerie green quality. The understory became a maze of fallen logs, dense shrubs, and patches of thorny undergrowth that caught at our clothes and gear. The silence was the first thing I noticed. On the main trail, we'd heard the normal sounds of forest life. Bird calls, squirrel chatter, the rustle of small animals moving through the leaves. But as we pushed deeper into the backcountry, the woods grew quieter. Not the peaceful quiet of evening settling in, but an oppressive, watching silence that made every snap of a twig under our boots sound like a gunshot. "David," I said after we'd been hiking off trail for about 30 minutes, "are you sure we're heading in the right direction? This doesn't match what I remember from the topo map." He stopped and pulled out his GPS unit, frowning at the display. "That's weird. It's showing us about half a mile southeast of where we should be." He turned the unit off and on again, waiting for it to reacquire satellites. Must be the tree cover messing with the signal. But when the GPS came back online, it showed the same location. According to the device, we were standing in an area that should have been marked as a small pond on the topographical map. There was no pond anywhere around us. "Technology," David muttered, shoving the GPS back into his pack. "Give me a compass any day." He pulled out his orienteering compass and took a bearing. "We're still heading in the right general direction. The campsite should be another mile or so this way." I wanted to suggest we turn back and find a spot closer to the main trail, but David was already moving forward with the determined stride of someone who didn't want to admit he might be lost. I followed, telling myself that experienced hikers got turned around in unmarked wilderness all the time. It was part of the adventure. The forest continued to close in around us. The trees seemed to grow larger and more imposing the deeper we went, their trunks massive and dark with age. Some of the oaks looked like they'd been growing since before the logging boom David had mentioned, ancient survivors from a time when this whole region was pristine, old-growth forest. Their presence should have been majestic, but instead felt vaguely menacing, as if they'd witnessed things that trees shouldn't see. We'd been hiking for another 40 minutes when David suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. I almost walked into him. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I listened carefully. At first, I heard nothing but our own breathing and the soft whisper of wind through the branches high above. Then, faintly, I caught it, a sound like someone calling out in the distance. It could have been a lost hiker, or maybe just the cry of a bird I didn't recognize. But there was something about the tone that made my skin crawl. "Probably just a hawk," I said, though I didn't quite believe it myself. David stood motionless for nearly a full minute, head cocked like a hunting dog catching a scent. The sound didn't repeat. Finally, he shouldered his pack again and resumed hiking, but I noticed he'd unclipped his knife and was carrying it loosely in his right hand. The campsite, when we finally found it, was perfect, almost too perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering oaks, with a seasonal creek running along one edge and a natural windbreak of boulders on the western side. The ground was level and covered with a thick carpet of fallen leaves that would provide excellent padding under our tents. A ring of blackened stones near the center indicated other campers had used this spot before, though the ashes in the fire ring looked old and undisturbed. "This is it," David said, and for the first time all afternoon, he sounded genuinely relaxed. Home sweet home. We made camp efficiently, working together with the practiced rhythm of experienced hiking partners. David's tent went up on the eastern side of the clearing, mine on the western side near the boulder windbreak. We strung a bear rope between two trees for our food, gathered firewood from the abundant deadfall around the site, and had a cheerful blaze going just as the sun began to set behind the canopy. The fire changed everything. With the warm orange light pushing back the gathering darkness, the campsite felt cozy and civilized. We cooked a simple dinner of freeze-dried stroganoff and shared a thermos of coffee spiked with bourbon that David had smuggled in despite our agreement to keep the trip alcohol-free. The earlier tension melted away as we fell into our usual pattern of easy conversation and comfortable silences. "You know what I love about places like this?" David said, poking the fire with a stick to send up a shower of sparks. "It reminds you how small you are, how insignificant. Back in the city, you start thinking you're the center of the universe. But out here," he gestured at the dark forest surrounding us, "out here, you remember you're just another animal trying to survive." It was a typical David observation, half philosophy, half pretension, but delivered with enough genuine feeling that you forgave the pompous parts. I was about to respond with some equally pretentious observation about modern man's disconnect from nature when we heard the sound again. This time it was closer and unmistakably human. A long, drawn-out call that seemed to come from the woods to our south. It could have been someone calling for help or trying to locate a missing companion. But there was something wrong with the tone. Too sustained, too musical, like a voice trying very hard to sound human and not quite succeeding. David was on his feet immediately, knife in hand. "Hello," he called out toward the sound. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" His voice echoed off the trees and faded into silence. No response came. "Could be another camping party," I said, though I was reaching for my own knife. "Maybe someone got separated from their group." "Maybe." David didn't sound convinced. "But who goes hiking alone in unmarked wilderness? And why would they be calling like that instead of using a whistle or something more practical?" We waited by the fire for nearly 20 minutes, listening carefully and occasionally calling out offers of assistance. The sound didn't repeat. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it had been a loon or some other bird we weren't familiar with. Nocturnal wildlife could sound remarkably human at a distance. But sleep was difficult that night. Every snap of settling wood in the fire, every rustle of wind through the leaves sounded amplified and potentially threatening. I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at the thin fabric of my tent ceiling, hyper-aware of how little protection it offered. The darkness outside felt absolute and hungry, pressing against the thin walls like a living thing trying to find a way in. I must have dozed eventually, because I was awakened around 3 a.m. by David calling my name. "Mike, Mike, wake up. Something's wrong." I unzipped my tent flap and peered out. David was standing by the dead embers of our fire, fully dressed and holding his headlamp. In the red glow of the LED, his face looked pale and strained. "What's wrong?" I whispered, struggling into my boots and jacket. "My GPS is dead, completely dead, and my phone, and my backup GPS unit." He held up the devices one by one. "Everything electronic I brought is fried. What are the odds of that?" I checked my own gear. My phone showed no signal, which was expected, but it was also completely unresponsive to any input. The screen remained black no matter which buttons I pressed. My GPS unit was similarly lifeless, as was my digital camera and even my LED headlamp. The only light source that still worked was David's old-fashioned headlamp with replaceable batteries. "EMP?" I suggested weakly. "Solar flare? In the middle of Missouri? Come on." David's voice carried an edge of panic that I'd never heard before. "And look at this." He led me to the edge of our campsite where we'd hung our bear rope. The heavy nylon cord had been cut, not gnawed by an animal, but sliced cleanly through with something sharp. Our food bags lay scattered on the ground, but nothing had been taken or even opened. Someone or something had simply cut down our supplies and left them. "When did you discover this?" I asked, checking the knots on my side of the bear rope. They were intact, which meant whatever had cut the rope had climbed or reached up to access the center section. "About 10 minutes ago. I got up to take a leak and saw the bags on the ground." David was scanning the tree line with his headlamp, the beam shaking slightly in his unsteady grip. "Mike, I think we need to get out of here, like right now." I wanted to argue, to suggest rational explanations for the electronic failures and the cut rope, but standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to lean in toward our small clearing, rational thought felt like a luxury we couldn't afford. We broke camp in record time, stuffing gear into packs without our usual care for organization. The lack of artificial light made everything more difficult and more urgent. David's single headlamp created a small bubble of visibility in the overwhelming darkness, but beyond that narrow cone of light the forest felt infinite and malevolent. "Which way?" I asked as we shouldered our packs. Without GPS, we were navigating by compass and memory. David studied his orienteering compass in the headlamp beam. "Northeast should take us back toward the main trail, maybe 2 miles through the woods." 2 miles had never sounded so far. We left the clearing and plunged back into the forest, David leading with the headlamp while I followed close behind. The trees that had seemed merely imposing in daylight now felt actively hostile, their branches reaching down to snag our packs and their roots hidden beneath the leaf litter to catch our feet. Every shadow beyond the headlamp beam could have concealed anything, or anyone. We'd been hiking for about 30 minutes when David stopped abruptly. "Do you smell that?" he whispered. I inhaled deeply. Beneath the normal forest sense of decay and earth, there was something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. The smell seemed to be coming from our left, somewhere deeper in the woods. "Dead animal," I said, though the smell didn't quite match any deceased wildlife I'd encountered before. "Bear kill, maybe." David turned his headlamp toward the source of the odor, and we both saw it at the same time. About 50 yards away, barely visible in the edge of the light beam, something pale hung from the branches of a large oak tree. It was roughly human-sized and swayed gently in the night breeze. "What the hell is that?" David's voice was barely a whisper. I didn't answer, because I was afraid I knew exactly what it was. But instead of the horror I expected to feel, I felt a strange compulsion to move closer, to investigate. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but my feet were already carrying me toward the hanging shape. "Mike, don't!" David grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here, now." But it was too late. As we watched, the pale shape began to move. Not swaying in the wind, but moving with purpose, untangling itself from the branches with movements that were fluid and wrong. And as it moved, it began to make that sound again. The not quite human call we'd heard earlier, but closer now and more obviously artificial. David's headlamp beam trembled as the thing dropped from the tree and landed on the forest floor with unnatural grace. In the jumping light, I caught glimpses of pale skin stretched too tight over elongated limbs, of a face that might have been human once but was now something else entirely. We ran. I don't remember the conscious decision to flee. One moment we were standing frozen at the edge of the clearing. The next we were crashing through the underbrush in blind panic, David's headlamp creating a wild strobe effect as it bounced with his running stride. Branches whipped at our faces and gear, thorns caught at our clothes, and unseen obstacles threatened to send us tumbling with every step. Behind us, that horrible call echoed through the trees, seeming to come from multiple directions at once, and underneath the calling, we could hear something large moving through the forest, pursuing us with a speed and agility that no human could match. "The trail!" David gasped, pointing ahead with his headlamp. "I can see the trail markers." The blessed sight of official trail blazes appeared in the headlamp beam, and we burst out of the deep woods onto the established path like swimmers breaking the surface after nearly drowning. For a moment, the familiar packed earth and clear sight lines felt like sanctuary. The pursuing sound stopped immediately. The forest behind us fell silent. We stood on the trail, gasping and shaking, our headlamp beam pointed back toward the tree line. Nothing emerged from the woods. The silence stretched on until it became more unnerving than the chase had been. "What the fuck was that thing?" David whispered. I shook my head. I had ideas, stories I'd heard, legends from various Native American tribes about creatures that lived in deep forests and fed on human flesh. But saying those things out loud would make them real in a way I wasn't prepared to handle. "Let's just get back to the car," I said. The hike back to the trailhead should have taken us about 2 hours. We made it in 90 minutes, driven by adrenaline and the need to put distance between ourselves and whatever we'd encountered in the deep woods. David's headlamp died completely when we were about a mile from the parking area, but by then we could see the first hints of dawn filtering through the canopy, enough light to navigate by. We reached the Jeep as the sun crested the tree line, turning the forest from a nightmare realm back into a normal Missouri wilderness area. In the growing daylight, our panic seemed almost foolish. Animals in the woods, equipment failures, a deer carcass mistaken for something sinister, all perfectly rational explanations for what we'd experienced. "Jesus," David said, leaning against the Jeep's hood. "I feel like an idiot. We got spooked by a fucking owl or something." I wanted to agree with him, to laugh off the night's events and plan our next camping trip. But when I looked back toward the trail we'd just emerged from, I could swear I saw something pale moving between the trees, just beyond the range of clear vision. "Let's just go home," I said. The drive back to St. Louis was subdued. David tried to start conversations about what we'd experienced, attempting to rationalize and explain everything in terms of known phenomena. Equipment failures happened. Wildlife could sound remarkably human. Shadows and exhaustion could play tricks on the mind. By the time we reached the city limits, we'd almost convinced ourselves that our terror had been the product of overactive imaginations and too many horror movies. Almost. I should have known something was wrong when David called in sick to work the following Monday. In the 15 years I'd known him, he'd never taken an unscheduled sick day. When I stopped by his apartment that evening to check on him, he looked haggard and sleepless. "I keep thinking about that thing," he told me, pacing around his living room like a caged animal. "I keep trying to rationalize it, but Mike, I know what I saw. That wasn't an animal. That wasn't even human." I tried to reassure him, to reiterate all our logical explanations from the drive home. But privately, I was having the same thoughts. The smell, the movement, the sounds, nothing about our encounter fit with known wildlife behavior. "Maybe we should talk to someone," I suggested. "A park ranger or someone familiar with the Irish wilderness. They might have explanations we haven't thought of." David stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "I already did some research. Did you know the Irish wilderness was named after Irish immigrants who tried to homestead there in the 1800s? Most of them disappeared, just vanished into the woods without a trace." "David, that was 150 years ago. People disappeared in frontier areas all the time. Disease, accidents, conflicts with Native Americans. What about the logging crews in the early 1900s? Multiple reports of workers going missing, entire camps found abandoned with no signs of struggle. What about the hikers who've disappeared in that area over the past 20 years? 7 people, Mike. 7 people who went into the Irish wilderness and never came out. I hadn't known about any missing hikers, and David's intensity was starting to worry me. Where are you getting this information? Internet, old newspaper archives, missing persons reports. He pulled out his laptop and showed me a collection of browser tabs with headlines like "Hiker Missing in Mark Twain National Forest" and "Search Called Off for Missing Campers." Look at the descriptions of where they were last seen, all in the same general area where we camped. The articles were real, dating back over 2 decades. The missing people were experienced hikers and campers, not weekend warriors who might have gotten in over their heads. And in every case, search and rescue teams had found no trace, no abandoned gear, no signs of struggle, no remains. This doesn't prove anything supernatural, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. People get lost in wilderness areas. They fall into ravines, get injured and disoriented, die of exposure. The bodies might never be found. All 7 of them, with no trace? David closed the laptop and fixed me with a stare that was uncomfortably intense. Mike, I think we encountered something that's been living in those woods for a very long time. Something that doesn't want to be found, but doesn't mind being fed. I left David's apartment that night feeling deeply unsettled, but I attributed his obsession to stress and the natural human tendency to find patterns where none existed. I figured he'd calm down after a few days and we'd eventually laugh about our panicked flight from what was probably a startled deer. I was wrong. David didn't return to work the next day, or the day after that. When I called, he told me he was taking extended sick leave to research some things. When I pressed him for details, he hung up. I didn't see him again for 2 weeks. When he finally showed up at my door on a Thursday evening, I barely recognized him. He'd lost at least 15 pounds. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot, and he had the manic energy of someone who hadn't slept in days. But more disturbing than his physical appearance was the smell that clung to him, that same organic, wrong scent we'd detected in the forest. "I found it, Mike," he said, pushing past me into my apartment. "I found what we saw out there. David, you look terrible. When's the last time you ate something? Or slept?" "Sleep is for people who don't have ancient predators stalking them," he replied, settling onto my couch with the careful movements of someone trying not to disturb injuries. "I've been back to the Irish wilderness 4 times in the past 2 weeks. I know where it lives now." The pronouncement hit me like ice water. "You went back? Alone? David, that's insane." "Is it? We left unfinished business out there. We ran away like scared children instead of facing what we found." He leaned forward, and I caught another whiff of that horrible smell. "But I went back, Mike. I went back and I learned things." "What kind of things?" David reached into his backpack and pulled out a manila folder stuffed with papers, printouts, photocopies, handwritten notes. The Irish immigrants didn't just disappear, Mike. They were taken, systematically. Over the course of 3 winters, entire families vanished from their homesteads. But the survivors left records, diary entries, letters to relatives back east. He thrust a photocopied page at me. The handwriting was old-fashioned and difficult to read, but I could make out phrases like "the pale one who calls in the night" and "took young Sean while he slept, left only marks in the dirt." "This could be anything," I said. "Folklore, superstition, people trying to explain tragedies they didn't understand. Look at this one." Another photocopy, this one from what appeared to be a 1920s newspaper. "Logging camp foreman reports 7 men missing after night shift. Something came down from the old woods," he told authorities. "Something that walked like a man, but weren't no man." Search teams found tracks leading into the deep forest, but lost the trail after half a mile. David had dozens of similar accounts spanning over a century. Stories of pale figures glimpsed at the edges of clearings, of calls in the night that lured people away from safety, of disappearances that followed no logical pattern except proximity to the deepest, oldest parts of the Irish wilderness. "Even if all this is true," I said, setting down the papers, "what are you planning to do about it? Call the authorities? They'll think you're having a breakdown." "I'm going to kill it." The simple statement hung in the air between us like a physical presence. David said it with the same tone he might use to discuss killing a spider or taking out the trash. "David, listen to yourself. You're talking about hunting some kind of monster in the middle of a federal wilderness area. You're talking about murder. It's not murder if the thing you're killing isn't human, and I've seen it up close now, Mike. I know what it is." He reached into his backpack again and pulled out a digital camera, apparently the only piece of electronic equipment that still worked for him. "I got pictures." The images on the camera's display were dark and blurry, shot with the flash in low-light conditions. But in several of them, I could make out a pale, elongated figure moving between trees. The proportions were wrong. Arms too long, legs that bent at unnatural angles, a torso that seemed stretched and distorted. And in one particularly clear shot, I could see the face. It might have been human once. The basic structure was there: 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but everything was wrong. The eyes were too large and reflected the camera flash like an animal's. The nose was little more than slits in a face that seemed to have too much skin. And the mouth? The mouth was full of teeth that no human should possess. Not fangs or animal canines, but rows of sharp, irregular points that seemed designed for tearing rather than chewing. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, staring at the image. "It's been living in those woods for a very long time," David said, taking back the camera. "Feeding on anyone stupid enough to venture too deep into its territory. The Native Americans knew about it. That's why they avoided that particular area even when the rest of the region was heavily traveled. The early settlers learned too late. Even if that's true, David, you can't just decide to hunt this thing. You're not a soldier or a hunter. You're an accountant who likes to go hiking on weekends." "I've been preparing." He opened his jacket to reveal a hunting knife strapped to his belt and what looked like a military surplus pistol in a shoulder holster. "I know where it sleeps during the day. I know its patterns. Next weekend, I'm going back to finish this." I spent the next hour trying to talk him out of what I was increasingly convinced was a suicidal mission. But David had moved beyond rational argument. He'd become fixated on the creature to the point of obsession, and no amount of logic or pleading could dissuade him. "Come with me," he said as he prepared to leave. "You saw it too. You know what's out there. Help me end this. David, if you go back to those woods, you're going to die, and I'm not going to help you commit suicide." He paused at my door, and for a moment, his manic intensity flickered. I caught a glimpse of my old friend underneath the obsession, tired, scared, and very much alone. "It's not suicide if I win," he said quietly. Then the intensity returned. "But if I don't come back, you'll know I was right about everything." That was the last time I saw David alive. He didn't return from his planned weekend trip. When he failed to show up for work on Monday, his office called his emergency contact, me. I contacted the authorities and reported him missing, providing them with his planned destination and timeline. The search and rescue operation lasted 4 days. Teams with dogs combed the Irish wilderness, focusing on the areas where David was most likely to have gone based on his previous trips. They found his Jeep at the familiar trailhead, keys still in the ignition and his wallet on the dashboard. His tent and camping gear were discovered about 3 miles into the backcountry, set up in a small clearing that was almost certainly the same spot where we'd camped weeks earlier. But they never found David. What they did find, in a police evidence bag that I was never supposed to see, was David's camera. A sympathetic sheriff's deputy let me look at the final images while we waited for the official search to be called off. The last photos showed David's campsite at night, illuminated by camera flash. In the first few images, everything looked normal: his tent, his gear, the surrounding forest. But in the final picture, taken at 3:17 a.m. according to the timestamp, something else was visible. David stood in the center of his campsite, but he wasn't alone. The pale figure from his earlier photographs stood behind him, one elongated hand resting on David's shoulder in a gesture that was almost companionable. And David was smiling. Not the strained, manic smile I'd seen during his obsessed weeks, but a peaceful, content expression that I recognized from our years of friendship. He looked relaxed and happy in a way he hadn't since before our first trip to the Irish wilderness. That was when I understood. The thing in the woods hadn't killed David, at least not in any conventional sense. It had claimed him, the way it had claimed the Irish immigrants and the loggers and all the others who had disappeared over the decades. And somehow, David had gone willingly. I never returned to the Irish wilderness, and I never told the authorities about David's research or his photographs. What would be the point? They would have dismissed it as the fantasy of a disturbed mind, and the thing in the woods would continue to feed undisturbed. Sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet and my apartment feels too isolated, I think I hear that sound again. The not quite human call that we first heard from our campsite all those months ago. It's probably just my imagination, the product of guilt and unresolved trauma. But sometimes I wonder if the thing in the Irish wilderness has learned that prey can be drawn from further away than just the deep woods. Sometimes I wonder if it's learned to hunt in the city. And sometimes, on the very worst nights, I wonder if the sound I'm hearing isn't the creature calling at all. Sometimes I wonder if it's David. I've started sleeping with lights on and keeping weapons within reach. I've installed extra locks on my doors and windows. I've considered moving to another city, or another state entirely. But deep down, I know it wouldn't matter. The Irish wilderness has a way of calling its own back, and whether the invitation comes from an ancient predator or from my missing best friend, I'm afraid that eventually I'm going to have to answer. The therapist thinks I'm making progress, but she doesn't understand that some experiences can't be rationalized or processed away. Some things, once encountered, mark you forever, and some places in this world are exactly as wild and hungry as they appear to be. I write this as a warning and a record. If you're ever hiking in Missouri's wilderness areas, stay on the established trails. Don't venture too deep into the unmarked backcountry, especially in places with names like the Irish wilderness or Devil's Backbone. And if you hear something calling in the night, something that sounds almost human but not quite right, don't investigate. Don't make David's mistake. Some invitations are better left unanswered.